This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. They'll never let the true facts of some of their lords to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
Don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions, Jack.
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 21. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we are, as promised for the Alwar frequency, we are going to take a dive into one of the most notorious trials in American history. One that has truly reverberated throughout the ages.
Yes, it certainly reverberated through the ages. And this is a topic that originally came up in our episode on giants. And we were discussing the giant enthusiast Cotton Mather, who's sort of widely known as someone who was kind of this wild-eyed, very religious maniac who was stoking up these witch trials. But in the final analysis, I think we can say that Cotton Mather did nothing wrong.
I would say that's pretty.
Cotton Mather did nothing wrong.
And tangential to that, folks, Miller lied.
Yes, Miller definitely lied. Not only did Miller lie, but the sort of popular historiography around the Salem witch trials, like the basic notion of how it went down, which is heavily shaped by Arthur Miller, but also people who, like you, of whom you would expect a little bit more, like historians. That's like, there's a lot of bullshit in that too. Yeah, I mean, Cotton Mather did nothing wrong, like, relatively speaking. I mean, he was still, like, a colonial, like, Puritan who, like, probably wanted to commit genocide against Native Americans or whatever, but relative to the witchcraft trials, he didn't really do too much that was wrong.
Much to my surprise.
He defended, the judges. He kind of stood up for his friends in authority who were a bit more guilty of doing some stuff that was arguably wrong. I mean, the main thing is that it's possible that, let's go over it systematically, I think. Okay. One of the key texts that we looked at for this episode is a true gem of a book by Chadwick Hansen, which is called Witchcraft at Salem. Yes. And the thesis of the book basically is, it's a broad reappraisal of certain aspects of the popular narrative, but one of the most sort of controversial is that, it argues that there actually was witchcraft being practiced in Salem at the time.
Exactly.
Yes, some of the people who were hung for witchcraft actually did practice witchcraft. This came out in 1969. So
it did. With a benefit of kind of modern psychological insights, I would say. As an author who is familiar with Freud, and
it's definitely not the first. I mean, obviously not, because there were people at the time, but it's also not the first book, like in the intervening centuries, to have contended something to the effect of the argument that there were witches practicing witchcraft involved in this. But it's definitely, the most recent and the most academic, the one that would most pass muster with your sort of. Although, I mean, in today's climate, I'm sure this guy would be canceled instantly.
I would make a strong case that the daughters of the witches that they couldn't burn would come after him pretty hard.
Yes, they definitely would.
Broadly speaking.
It's funny how he talks. It's because he says witchcraft today is mostly extinct, in the Western world, because people have stopped, believing in its effects. Well,
I don't know. As subliminal jihad.
It's back. Well, he was writing in the 70s, so maybe then
true.
It was, but it's roaring back. It's roaring back.
Right after the release of Rosemary's Baby, and when a certain sorcerer was over in Vietnam doing Operation Wandering Soul, it was definitely making a comeback, baby. Definitely making a comeback. But before we jump into his sort of counter narrative, maybe should we sort of read the official history, or just go over it real quickly? He actually
gives a good summary of he says the traditional interpretation of what happened at Salem is as much the product of casual journalism and imaginative literature as it is of historical scholarship. It might be summarized as follows: 1, no witchcraft was practiced in Massachusetts. 2, the behavior of the, quote, afflicted persons, including their convulsive fits, was fraudulent and designed chiefly to call attention to themselves. 3, the afflicted persons were inspired, stimulated, and encouraged by the clergy, especially Cotton Mather, who used the fear of witchcraft as a means of bolstering their sagging power in the community, or their flagging power in the community. And 4, the clergy whipped the general populace into a state of mass hysteria with their sermons and writings on witchcraft. 5, the only significant opposition to the proceedings at Salem came from the merchant class, specifically from Thomas Brattle and Robert Calef. And 6, the executions were unique in Western civilization, and therefore monstrous, and attributable to some narrowness or fanaticism or repressiveness peculiar to the Puritans. So basically, none of that stuff is true. I think that we can fairly say. You don't have to agree with everything in Hardwick or in Chadwick Hansen, but I think most of that stuff really is false, that he names as being false. The clerical class, and in particular Cotton Mather, really did try to tramp down on this and approach it with a little bit of moderation. And the whole aspect of the afflictions, those were all, his argument is that they were induced through basically the belief in it, through a kind of self-hypnosis, a kind of psychogenic reality, that these, fits actually did happen. And that in certain cases, these effects were being sought by people who were practicing forms of image magic,
exactly. I think that it really the strongest light in which you could or I think the greatest achievement of his writing is to kind of break down a lot of these historical fallacies that snuck into the narrative over the centuries and are actually almost incredibly easy to sort of debunk them as somewhat ahistorical, even before you get into the facts of the case. Just the idea that witchcraft trials were a rare, monstrous anomaly in the 17th century is kind of patently ridiculous if you look at what was going on in Europe in the 17th century. And he makes a really convincing case right out of the gate that, first of all, this is happening within a context, within a social and religious context at the time where these were incredibly common. And in fact, in England, the typical penalties, that for one, there were way more witch trials in England throughout this century than there were in New England. And second of all, the rate of like execution, and usually in a much more grisly manner than by hanging, usually burned at the stake, or I don't know, drowned, whatever it may be. Basically, it was much more common in England and also on the European continent to execute witches. And so you can't really look at, I know it's like, it's very tempting to look at, like, look how ideological and religious these Puritans were. And you can definitely make, I think, arguments about that in a broader sense about, Puritan strains of, the theocratic government and whatnot. And obviously their status as like settler colonists who own slaves. There's a lot there. But to say that they're particularly, it's almost like I feel like in a certain particularly white liberal imaginary in America, the absolute worst thing about the Puritans was not any of the stuff I just mentioned, but the fact that they falsely accused people of doing witchcraft. And as if this is a totally wacky kind of, maniac cult kind of society, like Handmaid's Tale or something, where they just did these frightening, trials and stuff. But in fact, this was part of a much larger. So, when they cite the texts of people like Cotton Mather writing about witchcraft, it's, he's writing about something that is a very common phenomenon and was believed in by the vast...
Everyone believed in.
Everybody, almost without exception.
Including the people who were skeptics believed in it. It was just a matter of, how it worked. That was what people disagreed about. And, someone Thomas Hobbes or whatever, or someone who... disbelieved in the actual ability of, for instance, and this is something that Manson quotes. He says Thomas Hobbes wrote, "As for witches," he wrote in his Leviathan, "I think not their witchcraft has any real power, but yet that they are justly punished for the false belief that they can do some mischief, join with their purpose to do it if they can, their trade being nearer to a new religion than to a craft or a science." So basically, he writes, "If you had been sticking pins into your neighbor's image or casting spells on his cow, you would not have wanted Thomas Hobbes to be your judge. He would have believed in your, he would not have believed in your occult powers, but he would have hanged you anyway for your heresy and for your malice." So that was the kind of disagreement that people had. They still believed in this heretical religion of witchcraft. They believed in the phenomenon of the practice of witchcraft. Some disbelieved in its power. For various reasons, but also everyone was Christian. Everyone believed in God. The sort of dispute would be well, why would God let almost it was extremely rare there was anyone who was even an agnostic. The critique would almost be Robert Calef's critique. Someone who kind of exchanged letters with Cotton Mather. His whole thing was well, there isn't evidence in the scriptures for all these ideas that we have about witchcraft, the nocturnal flights, the witch's Sabbath, the witch's teeth, familiar, or why would God let the devil do this?
Exactly. It was it was fought out on that kind of terrain as opposed to is this totally just made up? And I just wonder, I think from the same chapter, just a little historical background that's provided in this book. He writes that the penalties for witchcraft were relatively light in the early years of Christian history. In the 7th century, Theodore, Archbishop of Canterbury, in his Liber Ponentialis, considered the penance appropriate to a person who has been imitating, quote, a stag or a bull, that is, making himself into a wild animal and dressing in the skin of a herd animal and putting on the heads of beasts. To quote, those who in such ways transform themselves into the appearance of wild animal, he assigned penance for 3 years because this is devilish. At this time, paganism was still so widespread and Christianity so new that according to the Venerable Bede, King Redwald of East Anglia, quote, had in the same temple an altar to sacrifice to Christ and another to offer victims to demons. So, it clearly, I think this idea that, I don't know, that like Christians like made up at one point. I think that's a common conception in a weird way, even though people also claim that witchcraft has been around forever, but basically that this type of like spooky witchcraft that's like done with malice basically is like an invention of the church's fevered imagination and probably a cynical ploy to like control people. But as you see here, like these were longstanding traditions that for a long time coexisted alongside with Christianity and probably only later were criminalized, and probably around the time that like the Malleus Maleficarum was written, I think in the 14th century, that basically called for the eradication of witches. And said,
it was like a guide for the Hammer of the Witches. Yeah, it was written it was published in the 15th century. And yeah, it definitely endorsed their extermination and like, had like a program for how to go about it. And I guess like even like what is kind of described as like white magic in this book, it was something that was practiced even by people that consider themselves to some extent like scientists or materialists. Like he has this kind of a very interesting passage about Francis Bacon, where he says, "We forget that Bacon believed you could cure warts by rubbing them with a rind of bacon and hanging it out of a window that faced south, and that witchcraft may take place, quote, by a tacit operation of malign spirits. We forget that Boyle believed in an astonishing and repulsive variety of medicaments, including stewed earthworms, a worsted stocking that has long been worn next to the flesh, and human urine. The latter substance, taken both internally and externally, was one of the favorite items in his pharmacopoeia. It would, he thought, quote, require rather a whole book than a part of an essay to enumerate and insist on its medical virtues. It was Boyle who proposed that English miners be interviewed as to whether or not they, quote, meet with any subterraneous demons, and if they do, in what shape and manner they appear, what they portend, and what they do. And Newton, the greatest scientist of his age, spent more of his time on the occult than he did in the study of physics, as we've said many times. He explicated, for example, apocalyptic passages in the Bible and interpreted the measurements of Solomon's temple, hoping in both cases that a mystic reading of the scriptures would lead him to the innermost secrets of the universe." So, and it says, we should remember also that the 17th century firmly believed in a dualistic universe, in a material or visible world and a spiritual or invisible world as well. Heaven was still a concrete reality, as were the angels who inhabited it. So was hell and its devils. This was even among the most learned kind of scientists of the time. They were like drinking urine and, looking for demons and mines and doing all kind of, like Cotton Mather was looking for giants. And this was widespread. The giants, that is the biggest thing that, we've ever dealt with or whatever. That's a serious issue. So he was right about that as well. But, really what's interesting is that the thing about Salem that really makes it unique is that they realized, within a matter of years, including, even people who were involved in the trials, realized that they trapped the innocent as well as very likely some people who were guilty, if not maybe deserving to be hung for what they had done. And they felt bad about it and took responsibility and tried to come clean. And that's what was unique about it and part of why it's so ignominious now. But there were so many trials subsequently where that didn't happen. Even before there was a whole witchcraft panic across Europe. It's weird because it kind of happened a little bit after that, but there still were hangs for witchcraft in subsequent years. The last person to be killed for witchcraft in an English-speaking country was Sarah Bassett, a black slave who was burned at the stake in Bermuda in 1730. So that was considerably after Salem, which was, in the late 17th century.
Interesting. And a much more brutal method of execution as well.
Yeah, there were executions throughout the 18th century on the continent, though. In France, there was one in 1745. In Germany, 1775. In Spain, in 1781. In Switzerland, in 1782. And in Poland, in 1793. So, yeah. And then, there's, even in the 20th century, like, there was that Pennsylvania German witch murder, the sort of powwow doctor who was killed. But that's maybe another episode. But yeah.
And the attempted burning of a certain Setian leader who was falsely and scandalously accused in the 1980s.
Yes, indeed.
I guess we did see a little bit of a comeback of it in the 1980s.
True. Well, all witch trials ensnare the innocent as well as the guilty.
If you want to think about that, what's more Shaitanic than that? Of getting people to turn on each other.
Yeah, well, that's interestingly enough, turning maybe to the Cotton Mather's own words in his notorious Wonders of the Invisible World, his maniacal, what's often held up as his maniacal screed. And even Chadwick Hansen says that he comes off like a little crazy in this, whereas, he was much more moderate in most of his dealings. But I think that he doesn't come off as bad as in this as you would think. He even says, kind of in line with what you were just saying, that he's kind of urging everyone to sort of settle down, and he says something about a raven of peace that appeared. Yeah, he writes as for the honorable judges that have been hitherto in the commission, they are above my consideration. Wherefore I only say thus much of them, that such of them as I have the honor of a personal acquaintance with are men of an excellent spirit, and as at first they went about the work for which they were commissioned with a very aversion, so they have still been under heartbreaking solicitudes, how they might therein best serve both God and man. In fine, have there been faults on any side fallen into? Surely, they have at worst been but faults of a well-meaning ignorance. On every side, then, why should we not endeavor with amicable correspondencies to help one another out of the snares wherein the devil would involve us? To wrangle the devil out of the country will be a truly new experiment. Alas, we are not aware of the devil if we do not think that he aims at inflaming us one against another. And shall we suffer ourselves to be devil-ridden? Or by any unadvisableness contribute unto the widening of our breaches? To say no more, there is a published incredible relation which affirms that very lately, in a part of England, where some of the neighborhood were quarreling, a raven from the top of a tree very articulately and unaccountably cried out, "Read the 3rd to the Colossians, and the 15th. Were I myself to choose what sort of bird I would be transformed into, I would say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. Nevertheless, I will for once do the office, which, as it seems, heaven sent that raven upon, even to beg that the peace of God may rule in our hearts." So, he kind of did suggest the idea that, these arguments and hostilities,
in
might be sort of brought on by, Shaitan himself. Although
the familiar form of a raven?
He was saying that the raven was dispatched by heaven to tell everyone to be peaceful.
Okay, gotcha.
And that their arguments were sort of demonic. But, that he was saying, this miraculous thing happened with a raven lately. Just one of the many sort of prodigies and miraculous occurrences that he believed in. But, so he definitely, entertained the idea that the devil could, manipulate these sort of proceedings and that type of thing. And that does come up in Chadwick Hansen's book a lot, where he basically he kind of he even mentions during the trial that some of the, I don't know which of the judges particularly, but some people were perhaps concerned when there were allegations that such and such a person had appeared in an apparition, that perhaps it was the devil impersonating that person to frame them for being a devil worshiper, but they actually weren't, to get the community to execute all their most prominent citizens. Yeah, and that was Cotton Mather's whole thing, really. The big problem with Salem that's held up is that spectral evidence was used as sufficient evidence. People would see specters and they'd be like, okay, well, that's proof. But really, Cotton Mather's whole thing was that you can't use spectral evidence as proof. It's just like an indication of like a cause for further investigation.
It's kind of it's circumstantial evidence, so it matters, but it's not definitive.
Yes. He writes in Wonders of the Invisible World. Even so, a specter, exactly resembling such or such a person, when the neighborhood are tormented by such specters, may reasonably make magistrates inquisitive, whether the persons so representative have done or said anything that may argue their confederacy with evil spirits, although it may be defective enough in point of conviction, especially at a time when 'tis possible some overpowerful conjurer may have got the skill of thus exhibiting the shapes of all sorts of persons, on purpose to stop the prosecution of the wretches whom due inquiries thus provoked might have made obnoxious unto justice. Quare, whether if God would have us to proceed any further than bare inquiry upon what reports there may have come against any man from the world of spirits, he will not by his providence at the same time have brought into our hands these more evident and sensible things, whereupon a man is esteemed to be a criminal. So basically he's saying, like, if God is going to let, like, spectral evidence convince someone, he's going to give us more, like, you know, material evidence to, like, convict them as well. So we should, this is a good way to inquire. His rhetoric is quite, old, Middle English, but that's the gist of what he's getting at.
And yet he gets painted as being kind of somehow the psychopathic mastermind of this entire thing. Yeah, and so
this is by far his most wild book. Yeah, and he even quotes some stuff from theologian Perkins, I think William Perkins, William Perkins, who I guess was one of these like big Puritan theologians. You mentioned like the drowning of witches. He quotes like his whole method for detecting witches. It's quite rigorous. It's more rigorous than, Keith Rainier's method of detecting Luciferians. He says, like, if any man or woman be notoriously defamed for a witch, this yields a strong suspicion that the judge ought to carefully look at the report made by men of honesty and credit, or be made by men of honesty and credit. If a fellow witch or magician give testimony of any person to be a witch, this indeed is not sufficient for condemnation, but it is a fit presumption to cause a straight examination. If after cursing there follow death, or at least some mischief, for witches are wont to practise their mischievous facts by cursing or banning, this also is a sufficient manner of examination, though not of conviction. If after enmity, quarreling, or threatening, a present mischief does follow, that also is a great presumption. If the party suspected be son or daughter, the man servant or maid servant, the familiar friend, near neighbor, or old companion of a known or convicted witch, this may likewise be a presumption, for witchcraft is an art that may be learned and conveyed from man to man. Some add this for a presumption if the party suspected be found to have the devil's mark, for it is commonly thought when the devil makes his covenant with them, he always leaves his mark behind them, whereby he knows them for his own, a mark whereof no evident reason in nature can be given. A little bit like, rough there. But yeah, he, one important point that Perkins makes here is that, a testimony of a witch, there is a second sufficient conviction by the testimony of two witnesses of good and honest report, avouching before the magistrate upon their own knowledge. These two things, either the party accused hath made a league with the devil, or hath done some known practices of witchcraft. And all arguments that do necessarily prove either of these, being brought by two sufficient witnesses, are of force fully to convict the party suspected. If it can be proved that the party suspected have called upon the devil or desired his help, this is a pregnant proof of a league formerly made between them. I guess this is a different part, but anyway, he makes the point that, he says, if the devil tell the grand jury that the person in question is a witch, and offers withal to confirm the same by oath, should the inquiry receive his oath or accusation to condemn this man? Assuredly no. And yet this is as much as the testimony of another wizard, who only by the devil's help reveals the witch. So, you can't, take some of these witches are saying, as being, if someone's accused as a witch, when they accuse someone else, you shouldn't do that. Not that did in some ways happen at Salem, but that's because Cotton Mather wasn't there.
Cotton Mather was not involved. He was not involved.
He didn't. Yeah. Another key thing he says before we move on from this is that you mentioned the sort of drowning of witches, and Perkins, who Cotton Mather, I guess, swears by among this sort of triumvirate of theologians, some tokens for the trial of witches are altogether unwarrantable. Such are the old paganish sign, the witch's long eyes, the tradition of witches not weeping, the casting of the witch to the water with thumbs and toes tied across, and many more such marks, which if they are to know a witch by, certainly 'tis no other witch but the user of them. So that's a heavy thing, saying, like, if you're using these methods to find a witch, you're, like, really, the evil one.
It's interesting. It actually reminds me a lot. Have you ever seen the movie The Devils? From 1971, the Ken Russell film.
Right,
yeah. I actually think it's of all the movies kind of about like a witch trial or anything like that. I think it's kind of one of the more maybe like woke ones, even though it is based on a book by Aldous Huxley, who's a huge sus lord. I think the I don't know, not to ruin it too drastically for everybody, but I think the thematic kind of reveal of that movie is that, like, it goes further from just being, it's basically about a priest in a town in France who is accused by a sexually oppressed nun of, doing sexual things with the nuns under her care, and I think to her, and I think it's loosely based on maybe a real Urbain Grandier, a 17th century Roman Catholic priest, and there were a series of possessions in this nunnery in Loudun. And eventually this priest was kind of fingered as the wizard, if you will, who was, doing all these horrible things and stuff like that. So, I mean, this is the same century where Salem and all this other stuff is happening, but the kind of twist at the end, it goes further than just being like, oh, these are worldly kind of bad guys that are sacrificing him for like political reasons. And I think that at the end it kind of like it delves into kind of the territory of like they are actually the witches and they're sacrificing him. And the way that they all like laugh maniacally as he's like burned at the stake, and like it zooms in on their faces, and they're all like utterly demonic, and they're all these like corrupt bishops and things like that. Who, because he's like there's something going on, I don't know, with like the Huguenots and the king, and there's some beef going on that this priest has found himself like in the middle of, and I think he has some kind of somewhat unorthodox ideas about that he preaches from the pulpit that, more powerful people don't like. So they like set up this whole thing, and so it basically is like not just that they were like wrong, but like the accusers are the demons, and that's kind of so I mean it kind of checks out in that way, because I think it would be lame if it was just like he was wrongly accused. I don't know. It was originally rated X. It's a pretty wild movie, but
I remember seeing it a while ago. It's one of those very famous horror films. They screen it here a lot, around Halloween time.
Giles Corey was a wizard strong, a stubborn wretch was he, and fit was he to swing on high upon the locust tree. So when before the magistrates for trial he did come, he would no true confession make, but stayed completely dumb. Giles Corey, said the magistrate, what hast thou here to plead? To these that now accuse thy soul of crimes and horrid deed. Giles Corey, he said not a word, no single word spoke he. Giles Corey, said the magistrate, we'll press it out of thee.
It's an interesting take. I think that is that's kind of the conspiracy angle. In a lot of the whole thing of witchcraft is such a fascinating subject, and it's just endlessly interesting and something that you could just read about forever. But one thing that did kind of come up both in Hanson's book and a lot of the other books I read on the witchcraft hunt and the witchcraft phenomenon in general, it is kind of a combination of things on one level. Usually it's kind of at the level of the sort of peasantry or the lay folk who are looking for sort of old crones, old women who are sort of a burden to the community and being sort of misogynistic, whereas the more learned people, in some cases they might be exercising restraint, was the case arguably at Salem, but in other cases they might be sort of very zealous and persecuting, looking for witches, but they're looking for them in a very different way, and their criteria is different, and it's based on the real practice of ritual magic in elite circles. So what you sort of start to see happening with the idea of the witches' Sabbath and the sort of confederacy with the devil and these covens and these organizations is the combination of the sort of folk beliefs about witchcraft and the sort of just general misogyny across all stratas of society with these what you see kind of in the persecution of the Templars we talked about before, or in the Pope Boniface the Eighth situation where he was accused of doing this type of stuff. There's actually an interesting case that Hanson brought up of a witchcraft trial in 1680, just 10 years before Salem, that happened at the court of Louis the 14th.
Oh, okay.
And apparently it was really crazy, and it basically involved these satanic masses to try to get love potions by one of Louis's mistresses, and there was potentially some baby eating involved,
wow. Little Gilles de Rais kind of action.
The testimony says is that Louis's affections had become increasingly hard to hold, and Madame de Montespan therefore had recourse to more and more drastic measures. A number of priests were part of La Voisin's ring, and that's an occultist who was operating in this court. And in 1672, she called in the most depraved of these, the Abbé Guéborg, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, to perform amatory masses, which involved using Madame de Montespan's naked body as an altar on which to place the chalice. It also required the ritual sacrifice of an infant, part of whose blood was mixed with flour in the chalice to make an obscene sacramental wafer. At the conclusion of the Mass, the wafer and some of the infant's blood were given to the Sun King's mistress. As the strongest of love potions, they were to be mixed with this food as before. Amatory masses were performed again in 1676, but by 1679, the Montespan concluded that she had lost the king and ordered a mortuary rather than an amatory mass. When that piece of imitative magic did not succeed in killing Louis, she planned to poison him, but La Voisin was arrested before the plot could be carried out. As we have seen, the testimony is sensational and it was obtained under torture. It is not surprising that many have refused to believe it, but there was reason to think that Louis believed it. La Reynière urged the king to make the testimony public so that the worst of the ring, figures like Abbé Guéborg, might be brought to trial. The king would agree to their trial, but not to making public any of the accusations against Madame de Montespan, and La Reynière felt he could not proceed without these. Eventually, the difficulty was solved with lettres de cachet, letters from the king, by which any of his subjects could be imprisoned for life without trial. La Voisin had been burned at the stake in 1680 before anyone had mentioned the name of the king's mistress. But the surviving members of her ring ended their lives chained to the walls of the French prison. The last of them died in 1724, 32 years after the last witch was hanged in Massachusetts. Salem and Versailles were alike in revealing the escape of the distinguished members of the community implicated in the course of their witchcraft investigations. but in virtually everything else they differed, and all the differences suggest that the French court was more brutal and barbaric of the two communities. Torture, secrecy, imprisonment without trial, these are the methods of the old regime. During and after the Salem trials, witchcraft was a matter of continual debate, and when as a result of that debate it became apparent that the innocent had suffered, both individuals and the state did what they could to make reparations. The French court could hardly make reparations if reparations were in order, as they must have been in some instances. Every witch hunt traps the innocent as well as the guilty. I like how he's always like, Hansen is always sort of gesturing the possibility that they were witches, because it had not put more than a minority of suspects to public trial. The letters de cachet had closed off not only all questions of guilt or innocence, but all possibility of debating them. So basically, like, again, compared to that whole like thing, the Salem situation, it's more public and therefore more known, but it's not like necessarily more invidious. Or sinister.
It's interesting that the public nature has not spared the Salem witch trials from becoming kind of the most notorious, the most evil, the worst thing ever, etc. It reminds me of I think I should just say explicitly, because I've joked about it several times, but I kept catching these strange parallels between this entire case, and it's almost part of the half serious structure of this entire episode. But when we say Henry Miller lied. Arthur Miller lied. Yeah. I don't know why I thought Henry Miller. When we say that Arthur Miller lied, we're referencing a book by a professor, Dr. Grover Furr, that is called Khrushchev Lied, the evidence that every revelation of Stalin's and Beria's crimes and Nikita Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress is provably false. Basically, this is, I don't know, in some ways kind of an intellectual exercise as to studying maybe, I think later on we could do a whole, Grover Furr kind of dive into, the particulars of that trial, but they're these kind of interesting synchronicities between them, where part of the reason, for one, that the show trials of the 1930s in the Soviet Union have such a kind of charged and negative reputation around the world is much like in Salem, some of the executioners, so to speak, people from the party, Nikita Khrushchev mainly, when he took over the party in the 50s, had this secret speech where he basically denounced all of the show trials and accused Joseph Stalin in particular of basically masterminding the entire thing as a conspiracy to murder everybody that perhaps opposed him in basically in this very domineering way. And it that has about as much currency as the idea that everybody who did the Salem witch trials was involved in some kind of evil conspiracy, and particularly the figure of Cotton Mather, who usually gets demonized as kind of the the mastermind of this whole thing, because he had written these treatises. He was ideologically obsessed with getting rid of witches, and this must have all been masterminded by him, has a certain kind of synchronicity with the argument that Grover Furr makes that Stalin gets pinned with all these things, that he personally masterminded all of this, but actually he wasn't as directly involved as as people assume, and actually he was counseling for caution. It was actually the local troikas that they basically established to adjudicate whether or not people were spies or wreckers or things like that basically kind of ran out of control. And actually there was a lot of popular outcry from even the people themselves to round up and execute and punish all these these saboteurs, these nefarious people that were running around as part of some kind of nefarious Trotskyite conspiracy. But again, kind of like Cotton Mather, the actual people in the Central Committee were focused on a military conspiracy involving Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan and maybe some Western countries that had basically turned a lot of generals and, people, politicians in the party, and were planning some kind of nefarious coup that would, basically take over the Kremlin and kill Stalin and Molotov and Beria and everybody else, and then like hand the country back to the capitalists or something like that. But then when in practice, what kind of happened was once they gave this kind of broad license to the masses to basically kind of become almost like an informal grand jury of sorts that could level accusations against somebody like in their town, maybe a boss they didn't like or something like that, then all of a sudden you started to see like all these people getting like shipped off to gulags, and like 700,000 people getting death sentences for being like Trotskyite saboteurs. And that's definitely an argument for another day, but there's just I don't know, it's funny to think about just some of because in a way, I mean, they call them show trials, but the quote that you just read about how the French were kind of in a way, it was worse that they sort of hid all their legal proceedings to the extent that they did have them. Whereas in the colonies in New England, they had public trials, but nobody ever calls the Salem witch trials show trials. I mean, I guess well, if we get to Arthur Miller, I mean, obviously he almost made like a very hardline comparison in his play to both. Basically, he was simultaneously criticizing the McCarthy House Un-American Activity Committee hearings, rooting out communists, and also kind of taking a shot at like the 1930s show trials in the Soviet Union. So in a weird way, I mean, like the modern thinking of this is almost that like there's something more offensive about putting it out in public, at that like this is all a show, this is all theater, to basically parade around the accused and then get the mob to kind of bay for their blood and have them hanged and stuff. And I don't know, there's a lot of like really interesting like psychosocial dynamics going on with kind of the way that how do you adjudicate, and I don't know, maybe even like the similarity between like somebody in like a satanic witch cult and like a Trotskyite wrecker. I don't know, like because in a way, like the way they were described was like they were these like demonic like underminers who were just trying to like kind of rip apart society from the underbelly and get everybody accusing you. But then you might even think of like the ultimate satanic thing would be to like get people killing their own people who are innocent. And I think both from the perspective, so let's just say for like hypothetically, if like Nazis did have some kind of like plot going on, but like I'm not saying there's any evidence for this, but like if they wanted like the Soviets to get paranoid and start like throwing people in gulags and like executing people to like weaken themselves, like that would be a clever satanic trick to pull, maybe.
Well, Cotton Mather had a quote that was something like, I'm trying to recall what it was. It's like, we shall come to have no Christ but a light within, and no heaven but a frame of mind, said Mather, if the materialist, the Sadducees, should succeed in destroying the belief in an invisible world. So basically, like, he saw at stake, like, in all of this, like, the possibility that, like, their whole idea of, like, their whole religious framework would deteriorate if, and a lot of material from the time about the legitimacy of witchcraft, there is this idea of these Sadducees, which is kind of like the same way like people who are like very particular about law are like called Pharisees or whatever. Like Sadducees are basically materialists, like their comparison.
Yeah,
to,
that was
like,
the slur of the day. Calling somebody a Sadducee.
Yeah, exactly. So definitely like the Salem witch trials did ironically like become a way, like something that's held up to sort of dismiss like any kind of like belief in the devil or anything like that, to excuse like the ultimate satanic panic. So in a way, like they the devil, you could say, like won out in this, and that's good, like I guess in the point of view of.
Well,
but,
no, I mean, and if you want to invoke the big time cliche of the greatest trick the devil ever played was like to see that he didn't exist. Like, what better thing than to like snarl up the judicial process and like wrongly, or even if you wanted to say if you wanted to get conspiratorial about the '80s satanic panic and how maybe certain cases cases. You know, I mean, some might say like the McMartin case, for example, or the lady that went on, I think, Geraldo and said she was like a baby breeder and ended up like being a liar and later like pretended to be a Holocaust survivor and stuff. Like that woman at least has been verified as like a fraud who is like not being honest. But then, you know, what's more satanic than like throwing somebody who's full of shit into the mix with like all these people that maybe have more true stories, and then getting people to dismiss the entire phenomenon based on like, you know, one turd in the punch bowl.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Arthur Miller, like his whole thing, and like not just him, because I mean he is like a playwright, so you would expect like some fictionalization. I mean, people really do like take that as being true, but like it's full of like fabrications. Like we were just talking before we started recording that in the play he represents like Abigail Williams and John Proctor as like being in some kind of relationship when like, you know, and she's like a sexy like teen like Winona Ryder type character, but like really she was like 11 and she and John Proctor like never knew each other. You know, so there's like,
John
that's, like,
Proctor
kind of the
was
crux of
John
the play.
Proctor was 60 when these trials happened,
and he wasn't like, you know, a noble Christian Bale martyr. He was like an abusive, like violent maniac who like tried to smack the fits out of Mary Warren and like threatened her with like hot tongs to make her stop having so
that is definitely something the Witchcraft in Salem book goes into pretty it gets established pretty early on, that like this idea that John Proctor was just like this solemn like good guy who was like sensible and stood up for his principles, or even that he was like a beautifully flawed individual who had this affair with like a teenager, even though like I don't know how old is Abigail supposed to be. I know it was the 17th century, still borderline like pedo, but also, you know, the from whatever historical evidence that we do have, he did very adamantly believe in beating the demons out of, you know, his daughters and other young girls who were
that typical
possessed.
Thing in like historical writing where there's always like some guy who like has like whatever the values of like the contemporary like, you know, audience will be like somehow. But anyway, but in his play, like, and also in like, you know, I came across when I was searching up some stuff, I came across this weird blog post by like, it was called like the Diabolical Delusions of Religion or whatever. It was like just some dumb blog by like some atheist guy who said like he would just read the Crucible like every year to remind himself of like the dangers of religion. And he also was reading this book also, which is literally from like the 19th century, called Salem Witchcraft, and he was like, this is the, you know, a magisterial like by Charles Wentworth Upham, who basically was the originator of the idea that Cotton Mather like stirred this all up, and that the whole thing was a conspiracy for like material gain by like the magistrates and like the ministers. But really, like, you know, people were always like talking about witchcraft, always being suspicious of witchcraft, and like those people for the most part were like, you know, like trying to tamp down on that stuff. In this case, like they did become convinced by what was going on because something was happening. Like these girls like were really having these crazy pathological fits.
So, I mean, should we talk like just to establish for a second about like what was actually happening to people that caused this whole idea? Because I feel like even with the Salem witch trial narrative that you get in like, you know, the modern U.S., it almost just it's like people were just saying like it almost implies that these girls were all making it up, right?
Yeah, like, it does. That's what the Crucible basically says, that they all lied to get out of trouble, but they weren't. They were actually experiencing these things. You could say they were psychosomatic, like whatever, but
definitely. I mean, there's definitely kind of an open door to that interpretation that it was like psychosomatic and everything. But as Witchcraft at Salem kind of really, I think, does a pretty good job of going into that, like, from even what we understood in the 1960s about, like, you know, pathological hysteria, is that it doesn't mean that it's like, quote, not real, and it certainly in a genuine case is not, you know, it's not something that the sort of the victim of it controls. I mean, it's something that sort of takes over you, and it has a lot more kind of complicated psychological roots than even to the point of like, you know, getting rashes or the feeling like they you know, things that look like bite marks or things like that, or you know, the lump in the throat kind of thing, like not being able to breathe. I forget the Latin version of that he makes reference to a lot, like basically translates to like the lump in the throat. Yeah, and also, like, it should be mentioned that a lot of these people, it seemed like they were really experiencing hysterical symptoms, and they were also accusing people of, spectrally haunting them, I guess, on the astral plane, as it were, or something like that.
Exactly. Of sending a spirit out to haunt them on the astral plane. Yeah, and that was often how witches were thought to attend these Sabbaths, was like in spirit, like astrally. And that is like maybe a permutation of other beliefs having to do with that. But anyway, so they definitely were, accusing them of this.
Yeah, and several people even admitted to practicing witchcraft as well.
Yeah.
Also a really important point that that is made in Witchcraft at Salem is it's an assertion. Let me see if I can find the exact quote here. He says basically, we must bear in mind that in a society which believes in witchcraft, it works. If you believe in witchcraft and you discover that someone has been melting your wax image over a slow fire or muttering charms over your nail parings, the probability is that you will get extremely sick. To be sure, your symptoms will be psychosomatic rather than organic, but the fact that they are obviously not organic will make them only more terrible, since they will seem the result of malefic and demonic power. So it was in 17th century Europe, and so it was in 17th century Massachusetts. And he says, the hideous convulsive fits were thought to be the results of witches and demons wrenching the bodies of their victims into torturous postures. The loss of hearing, speech, sight, appetite, and memory were deprivations caused by Satan himself. The contraction of the throat, the globus hystericus, was seen as an attempt by demons to make the victim swallow occult poisons, and when she swallowed rapidly and her belly swelled, what is actually involved here is a kind of accelerated ulcer formation, it was thought the demons had succeeded. When blisters appeared on the skin, many skin diseases are functional rather than organic, they were thought to have been raised by brimstone out of hell. Many of these symptoms, including the skin lesions, would pass fairly rapidly. So I think it's kind of a bold assertion. It would probably be somewhat maybe scoffed at today, but the idea that if you are living in a society which believes in witchcraft, it works.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Yeah, maybe some would scoff at it, but I think that that's a pretty moderate idea. Compared to the idea that witchcraft simply works no matter what. And I don't know. One of the most compelling things, or one of the most interesting incidents, is the levitation that occurred in the Margaret Rule case.
Yeah.
The Margaret Rule case was one where I guess that was kind of later on, and this was one that Robert Calef definitely raised some objections about. This is the one where he accused Cotton Mather of touching, rubbing this woman upon the breast or whatever, just to go over their debate. He accused him basically of looking under her bedclothes and doing stuff and trying to get her to name some more people. Mather wrote back to him, "'Tis as far from true that my apprehension of the imp about Rule was on her belly, for the oaths of the spectators, and even of those that thought they felt it, can testify that it was on the pillow at a distance from her body. As untrue representation is that which follows, that it was said unto her, that her apprehending of that odd, palpable, though not visible mover, was from her fancy. For I endeavored to persuade her that it might be but fancy in others, that there was any such thing at all. Witnesses every way sufficient can be produced for this also. It is falsely represented that my father felt in the young woman after the appearance mentioned, for his hand was never near her." That's Increase Mather, his father. "Oath can sufficiently vindicate him. 'Tis very untrue that my father prayed," then he goes on to how long his father prayed, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he just ends up saying, "I am not unwilling to communicate, a true and full narrative of my visit. In the meantime, must take liberty to say it is scarcely consistent with common civility, much less Christian charity, to offer the narrative now with you for a true one, till you have a truer or a full one, till you have a fuller, or for a full one, till you have a fuller." So, your sincere, though injured friend and servant, Cotton Mather. So basically, like, you know, he denied these things and produced, like, witnesses and testimony. You know, like, I do testify that I've seen Margaret Rule and her afflictions from the invisible world lifted up from her bed, wholly by an invisible force, a great way towards the top of the room where she lay. In her being so lifted, she had no assistance from any use of her own arms or hands, or any other part of her body, not so much as her heels touching her bed or resting any support whatsoever. And I have seen her thus lifted, when not only a strong person hath thrown his whole weight across her to pull her down, but several other persons have endeavored with all their might to hinder her from being raised up, which I suppose that several others will testify as well as myself when called to it. So that's what, you know, one person and several others sort of corroborate that. And Hansen sort of argues that this might be, he writes, like, these statements might possibly describe an arc de cercle, a violently arched position of the body not uncommon in hysterical fits, which would raise the trunk of the body a considerable distance off the bed. Combined with the power of suggestion to affect the bystander's senses, this might account for their belief that they had witnessed levitation, yet they were not simply bystanders, they were engaging in violent physical activity, trying to bring her body back to the bed. Such activity would ordinarily tend to break the power of suggestion, and levitation has been so frequently reported from so many times and places, from the 20th century Indian fakir to the medieval or Renaissance saint, that one cannot be at all sure there is a satisfactory explanation for it, particularly since so many witnesses insisted that no part of Margaret Rule's body was touching the bed. And in an arc de cercle, the head and feet do, of course, touch. Well, you know, he's kind of like saying, like, maybe she did levitate, but whether you think that or not, the point is, it was so dramatic that it wasn't fake. You know, like,
they weren't just putting it on.
There was a witch known as Old Meg. She hobbled around with only one leg. She'd limp into Gloucester a shilling to beg, and kept all her money nailed up in a keg. Pity Old Meg, pity Old Meg, kept all her money nailed up in a keg.
You know, I think that ties into a case that that Hansen describes, like, early in his book, where, you know, the Salem witch trials were not the first time that Cotton Mather became aware of a kind of witch situation in New England, because there was a guy named John Goodwin whose several children became kind of started exhibiting these systems in 1688, like a few years before the Salem trials, and I guess, that he also mentions the arc de cercle, which I looked up, and honestly kind of reminds me of the Jeffrey Dahmer victim, and also the headless statue in Tony Podesta's house, the Arch of Hysteria. It's almost exactly the same, but anyways, but yeah, there were things like that. He mentions elsewhere, I think later on, there were in the book, that there were levitation claims during Salem. But in this John Goodwin case, Cotton Mather was a medical student at the time, and he actually went and I think he brought some of these children into his home after a certain point to study them, and he left behind a lot of notes and things like that, and genuinely, like, he was more focused on helping them recover from this kind of, you know, curse or possession or whatever, than he was trying to hunt down the sickos who did this, which I guess, would maybe change later. But he mentions a few things, like, he said, yea, their heads would be twisted almost round. It sounds exactly like The Exorcist. And, crawling on the ceiling, doing the arc de cercle in a weird way, not being able to speak, or speaking in weird kind of dissociative, almost like multiple personalities kind of stuff. And, the person that was arrested in that case was Ann Glover, who was an Irish woman who was a housekeeper of John Goodwin, right? And in the summer of 1688, Martha Goodwin, who was 13, accused Anne Glover's daughter of stealing, well, I'm reading from the Wikipedia, so take this with a grain of salt. He accused Anne Glover's daughter, who also worked for them, of stealing laundry. This caused Anne to have a fierce argument with Martha and the Goodwin children, which then supposedly caused them to become ill and start acting strangely. The doctor who was called suggested it was caused by witchcraft because he could not offer another diagnosis or heal the children. And that was also a thing that Hansen mentions, which is like doctors commonly in the 17th century would diagnose things they couldn't explain with perhaps it was witchcraft. So that was like really kind of normal. And Hansen talks about, Goodwife Anne Glover, who was, I think, the last person to be hung for witchcraft in Boston. And eventually, I think, maybe got, so she was actually hung before the Salem witch trials began, but was the last person in Boston proper to be hung there. And I don't know. I mean, there was there was evidence brought into the court.
That was very I think he calls it like the most clear-cut case of witchcraft. Yes, he says.
This is
with goat's hair in them.
Yeah, he says there has never been a more clear-cut case of witchcraft because they found several small images or puppets or babies made of rags and stuffed with goat's hair and other such ingredients. And he says the image magic is the commonest form of black magic. The impulse behind it survives even when belief in magic is gone, as anyone knows who has torn up the photograph of a person with whom he was angry. College students are obeying the same impulse when they hang or burn someone in effigy, and it is worth noticing that hanging and burning were the means of executing witches. What is most important is that her witchcraft plainly worked, and in no indiscriminate fashion. When she tormented one of her dolls, one of the Goodwin children fell into sad fits. When it is remembered that in a society which believes in witchcraft, the violent hysterical symptoms to which the Goodwin children were subject not infrequently terminate in death, it cannot be said that the Boston court acted either harshly or unjustly. Indeed, when one considers the ferocity of 17th century English law, simple hanging seems almost a lenient sentence.
Word. Okay.
But you know what though? When Glover was on her way to the gallows, she announced that the children's afflictions would not cease at her death because others had a hand in the witchcraft as well as she, and the afflictions did indeed continue.
Well, yeah, I guess his idea is that, like, when witchcraft works, if these malicious occult activities actually have an effect, like, it is pretty, evil to do them. I don't know. That's quite
regardless
a bold,
of the
yeah.
I mean, that's again another strong parallel to Grover Furr. Was like every single one of these people was absolutely guilty.
Well, he does say that a lot of it. Like, there was one like little child, like I think Dorcas, who died. I forget what her last name was. Dorcas Good.
Wait, was the 5-year-old executed?
Yeah, she
okay, yeah.
That was
a little problematic.
Yes.
And I guess
if only Cotton Mather had been there to stop the madness. But
yeah, well, I mean, there are a couple. Well, Cotton Mather was kind of around this at the time, but he was, he was in medical school, and
Cotton Mather was involved with the Glover thing, but in that case, he had to do it. It was
he did say that when she came into his home that he observed flying, not in a way that was not in a way that she would like fly off into the air like a bird, but that she could like jump extra kind of high, and like it was at a level that was kind of physically impossible for a human, but she could kind of like lift up in the air and like levitate a little bit for like a moment and stuff like that. So he ended up being basically, I guess he saw his kind of a point of interest in all of this was because he was kind of an ideological opponent of the so-called Sadducees, the sort of not really materialist, but like materialist for their time. He thought that this was maybe a golden opportunity to kind of get into the evidentiary record, like a real case of like witchcraft, like a real like witch conspiracy going on. And if he could kind of, study the symptoms and all these other things, that he could basically convince these, Sadducees these doubters out here, that in fact the spirit world existed. Because, like we said, the other people, even though they were still Christians, were kind of doubting this idea that there was like a spirit world, and that, basically that witches, even though pretty much everybody believed that they existed to some degree, they believe, they obviously can't do anything because there is no kind of spirit realm that they can call on. And Mather strongly disagreed with that, but he wasn't saying like, hey, let's go to just like execute everybody and all that stuff. He still believed that you had to take a kind of prudent approach to investigating. He
definitely believed in the crime of witchcraft, as most people did, but he was definitely like, a more restrained person. And like it's actually similar. It's interesting that Goodwife Glover was Irish and really couldn't even speak English and really just spoke Irish and had to like have a translator.
Well, that was I was gonna mention, like, that's how she actually got sentenced to death, and I think maybe we could say that, like, maybe not the best jurisprudence ever. They basically asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer, and I guess, I don't know, the way Hansen describes it is that she did start doing it. She did start saying, the Pater Noster, but then like couldn't get past like certain lines in it, and like as hard as she tried, she couldn't bring herself to say these words. But if you look on Wikipedia, here we go through the looking glass, and it says, well, she was seen as a scandalous old Irish woman, very poor and a Roman Catholic, and obstinate in idolatry, which is, I guess, what Cotton Mather said about her. But I think they're kind of doing a thing there where it sounds like they're saying that because she's a Catholic, she's like a devil worshiper, which maybe he, like low-key, had a bias against Catholics, but they're almost making it seem like a one-to-one. I think he's talking about all the magic she
he does say that she couldn't recite her Pater Noster,
this website, it
said she could not repeat it if she might have all the world. So
exactly,
yeah. It's
but of course, it's written.
She had some kind of like block or whatever happening,
That's what the impression I get from Hansen's book. But then when you read the summary on Wikipedia, it says, at her trial, it was demanded of her to say the Lord's Prayer. She recited it in Irish and broken Latin, but was unable to say it in English. So. And then there was a belief that an inability to recite the Lord's Prayer was the mark of a witch. And, so that's kind of saying like, oh, like there they go again. Basically that because she couldn't speak English, she was declared, guilty, even though that when Hansen describes it in more detail, the context of that is different. It's not simply, it sounds like they're just being like kind of like mean to like this Irish lady and kind of saying, well, you can't say it in English. That's proof. And almost like in a very, deliberately like mendacious kind of way, finding a little trick to do that she can't, attest that she can't pass. Yeah, but the investigation,
exactly. It's kind of like the drowning thing or whatever. Yeah. But really there is like a whole thorough investigation and all this stuff. Suggesting that she practiced witchcraft was like discovered, including these dolls stuffed with like goat hair, and like spittle being applied to them and things like that. That's like kind of a lot in a way.
Yeah, but, and I think that I mean, she basically kind of she gave many pronouncements that basically kind of implied that like she implied that she was under some kind of pact where like she could not say the words.
She wasn't tortured or anything, right? But
no, I don't believe so.
She still basically said that she served the devil.
Yes, and then called out that like because there's like a conspiracy of witches, the torment of these children will go on after my death. That doesn't sound like the words of a wrongly accused person.
It doesn't.
Like, regardless of whether or not you think she like actually affected those things on them, it sounds like she thought that she affected those things on them, or was maybe quote unquote crazy or something like that. I noticed here though this Wikipedia article that's quite slanted kind of tells on themselves a little bit, because they do admit that There are several testaments as to her final words. Yeah, it even says here, when she was taken out to be hanged, she said that her death would not relieve the children of their malady. There are several statements as to her final words. According to some, she said that the children would keep suffering because she was not the only witch to have afflicted them, but when asked to name the other witches, she refused. Another account says that Glover said that killing her would be useless because it was someone else who had bewitched the children. Either way, Anne Glover did believe in witches. Now, here's the important part. A Boston merchant who knew her, Robert Calef, said that, quote, Goody Glover was a despised, crazy, poor old woman, an Irish Catholic who was tried for afflicting the Goodwin children. Her behavior at her trial was like that of one distracted. They did her cruel. The proof against her was wholly deficient. The jury brought her guilty. She was hung. She died a Catholic.
Wow.
Robert Calef, what are you doing hanging out with Anne Glover?
Wow.
What are you doing, man? Because
was this
as
guy
we'll see,
Catholic? Because that would explain a lot. Like the way he said she died a Catholic, kind of made him seem like he. It says on his Wikipedia article that he might have attended a dissenting academy, which would make him a Protestant. But it was weird that he would be like, she died a Catholic.
She died a Catholic. And so it's like worth noting. I think maybe we've mentioned. I don't know if we mentioned him once or twice, but Robert Calef almost became the sort of like the Trotsky to like Cotton Mather Stalin in a way. Like if one had not like ordered the assassination of the other right after these trials, because they both lived for a while after that, and they basically. It was Robert Calef, who was a wealthy cloth merchant in Boston, who kind of launched the first of a series of kind of diet of denunciations of the Salem witch trials, and particularly had it out for Cotton Mather, who he was I think the first person to sort of put Cotton Mather at the heart of this judicial conspiracy to wrongly accuse people of witchcraft.
We need a heroic pro-Cotton Mather Wikipedia editor to step up, because the Robert Calef article is also very slanted. It says, Mather, unsurprisingly, refuses to directly address many particulars of Calef's book, but rather accused Calef of being a follower of Satan and uses select quotes from the Bible intended to put the merchant Calef in his place, including Exodus 22:28. Thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. But we read from his replies, and that's not the tone that he took with him. He was like, you're injured if humble servant, like he was like, please, like, let me provide a fuller account of like, and like he gave all this testimony to what happened, like, so there's an incredible anti-Mather slant in the Wikipedia article.
The lies, the lies of the Calefites.
Yes,
basically.
Wow, talk about a real Caliph or an evil Khalifa, probably in league with ISIS. But yeah, it's interesting that Cotton Mather was a little bit of an Islamophobe, because he was an educated person, and he did say that one of the books that was observed, or the Devil's Book observed in one of these incidents, I think actually in the Rule case, he said that it bore like a certain resemblance to the Quran. He was a bit of an Islamophobe there. And this is, I guess, maybe a common thing in some of these witch things, where there's sort of like, and I even going back to the Templars, there's sort of little intimations of Islam. I read Carlo Ginzburg's book, Ecstasies, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath, and he kind of points back to like a case like early on, like in the 14th century, of like, some accusations against some lepers and Jews of sort of poisoning people, and like that it was all like a plot by the leader of the famous assassins, the Hashashin, or maybe of some other. They're always like described as some Muslim sovereign. So he kind of makes a connection between the ascription to Satan and the ascription to these different Muslim sovereigns, and of course there's like the Baphomet connection. So there's interesting stuff going on there. But I wanted to add to this that it's interesting though that Glover was Irish, because I read another book by Maeve Brigid Callan called The Templars, the Witch and the Wild Irish, which touches on the Witch of Kilkenny, who I guess was named Irish Alice Kittler. I think Alice was her first name. Yeah, Alice Kittler. I hope I'm pronouncing that right also. But she kind of pointed to this case as the one in which like the new image of the witch began to emerge. She talked about how like this was the first time that
there was like sex magic involved.
Yeah, like significant elements in the history of the prosecution of Push and Rivka emerged in this trial. An identification of sorcery and natural magic with demonic magic, an identification of magic with heresy, the witch's Sabbath, a pact between a demon and a witch in which sex and money were exchanged, a group of 12 witches who, together with their demon, Robert, or Robin, son of Art, formed the number for a coven, torture, and death at the stake. So, yeah, it's interesting that kind of happened in Ireland and was sort of merged in with the prosecution of heresy in Ireland, also by often some of these I guess they would have been Catholic authorities at the time, but they would be persecuting kind of like, it's interesting because a lot of Waldensians were a common sort of heresy that people were concerned about like early on, and a lot of the sort of witchcraft stuff. They were like sort of proto-Protestant group, that were like a very big heretic problem for Catholics early on.
Gotcha.
They kind of so a lot of the persecution of witches sort of interacted with that persecution, and like Waldensians were seen to maybe go to worship he-goats and things like that. But anyway, so in this trial, like some of those things took shape for the first time. The sort of judge or the prosecutor or the inquisitor in this matter, some dude who was named Richard de Lidrid, and this was in the 14th century, and he was a big Marian Catholic, but he was sort of knowledgeable of ritual magic, and he kind of did that same thing where all the accusations against the Witch of Kilkenny were coming from the lay people and people in her community. Because she had multiple marriages, stuff like that, and the author kind of leaves it open. The author kind of leaves it open whether she actually did any witchcraft or anything, because she might have used natural magic, she might have been making potions, things like that. But yeah, there definitely was that aspect. But she does point out that allegedly, 1/3 of her coven, once it was finally named, was supposed to comprise men. There is one interesting quote that is from Furr that she quotes in this book, the author. Insofar as necromancers, which were a real phenomenon of kind of elite magicians and alchemists who would practice necromancy, contributed to the plausibility of claims about witches, they bear indirect responsibility for the rise of European witch trials in the 15th and following centuries. To the extent that these early witch trials focused on female victims, they thus provided a particularly tragic case of women being blamed and punished for the misconduct of men. Women who were not invoking demons could more easily be thought to do so at a time when certain men were in fact so doing.
Okay.
So yeah, and the influence of necromancers at the papal court shaped the attitude of this guy, and he expected kind of these things. Among he said there was even possibly witchcraft among the Anglo-Irish religious. So he was, Master Peter de Ardennes, well known to all contemporary clerics of Ireland, was friends with the Spanish necromancer. So, some of the stuff, and this was kind of on the heels of the Templar stuff, so all that kind of bore an influence.
They came upon her like a host and bade her speak and tell why she had sworn a wicked oath to serve the powers of hell. Speak up, they hoarsely cry, the minister did swear. He cursed her with a heavy curse no mortal man may bear. Thou hast bewitched us, cried they all, and carried her away. In chains of iron, day and night, in Salem jail she lay. until at last the door stood wide. They led her then abroad by many an old familiar place. Her trembling footsteps trod.
Maybe it'd be good to talk for a sec about one of the people. There are a lot of people that were sentenced to death and accused in the Salem witch trials, but
most of them probably innocent.
But there is one. There is one individual.
Well, there's two, but there's one especially, maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, there's a little bit more than two who's probable, like that guy Burroughs, who really would boast of his occult powers at times. But we want to talk about Bridget Bishop, who actually, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I mean, you've mentioned that you live in California, so I'll mention that I live in Massachusetts, and I've actually been to Salem many times, which is now like kind of a weird, tourist trap, like type weird like place. It's especially crazy around Halloween, and they have like a lot of like, historical like and pseudo historical little things you can visit, like and they have like haunted houses and stuff, and like all these like little goofy things and like ghost tours and things like that. One of the more like historical or historically oriented one is this play that they do that's like top of the list of all like the Visitor's Guide to Salem, Visitor's Guides to Salem. It's called Cry Innocent. And it's basically like a dramatic reenactment of the trial of Bridget Bishop. And you like in the audience like play the jurors or whatever, and you get to like vote to convict or let her off. And I feel like probably most of the time people like vote to let her off. One time I did go, and I was just like, whenever she would talk, I'd just be like, witch! And we ended up kind of convicting her. I felt a little bit bad about it, but now that I read Witchcraft at Salem, I'm thinking maybe my instincts were correct.
Bishop,
she... it's because in the play they kind of portray her as like being like a nasty, a nasty woman, like in the Hillary sense, of like, but at the same time, like, and you kind of forget the context in a way, like, she's just being like loud and obnoxious and like kind of like, brazen to like her accusers and like defiant, but it's like, in the context of like the 17th century, like you've just been accused of a serious crime, like why are you acting like this? Like just chill out a little bit and like maybe you'll get off. Like why are you being, like it's, I don't mean to victim blame someone who like, got executed for witchcraft, but it is a little bit weird. And there's some evidence to suggest that maybe in addition to that, she might have been consulting with a certain old Nick. Yes. I see. Let's see. Was that actually Abigail Hobbs who mentioned? Yeah, they were kind of, I don't know, in a grouping, an examination on April 19th was Giles Corey, Abigail Hobbs, and Bridget Bishop. And Abigail Hobbs is a wild and irreverent young girl who on one occasion had parodied the sacrament of baptism by sprinkling water on her mother and pronouncing the words of baptism over her, and she had cultivated the reputation of a witch. When Lydia Nichols had asked her, quote, how she durst lie out of nights in the woods alone, Abigail replied that, quote, she was not afraid of anything, for she had sold herself body and soul to the old boy. On another occasion, she had told Lydia to hold her tongue or she would, quote, raise all the folks thereabouts, and told her to look, quote, there was old Nick over the bedstead. So, there's a, let's see. Not to be confused with Abigail Williams.
Not to be confused with Abigail Williams, yeah.
Lots of Abigails, lots of goody this, goody that. Yeah. But Bridget Bishop, Hansen writes that she was in all probability a practicing witch. She had a long-standing reputation for witchcraft. It was rumors that she had bewitched her first husband, a Goodman Wasselby, to death. In 1679/80, during her second marriage, she had been brought before the Court of Assistance for Witchcraft. The records of that trial do not survive, but it is probable that a major factor in her release at the time was the good opinion of her clergyman, John Hale of Beverly, who was then hoping better of Goody Bishop than others in the community. But Hale changed his mind by 1692. So she already been convicted of witchcraft and got off. Maybe that's why she was so
accused,
brazen. Accused of witchcraft and got off. Maybe that's why she was so brazen, because she thought she would get away with it at another time. But her famous line, she had the malice requisite to the craft, Hansen says. During her examination, when Hawthorne used the bullying techniques he had used on others, she startled him with an open threat. If I were any such person, she told him, you should know it. I.e., she would make him know it, she would use witchcraft upon him.
Mm-hmm. It's also worth noting that her present husband, circa 1692, Edward Bishop, was one of the people accusing her of witchcraft, and two women also testified that the husband had said that, quote, the devil did come bodily unto her, and that she was familiar with the devil, and that she sat up all night long with the devil, and I guess that she was well aware of her own reputation, and I guess two men also testified that being employed by Bridget Bishop, alias Oliver of Salem, to help take down the cellar wall of the old house she formerly lived in, we, the said deponents, in holes in the old wall belonging to the said cellar, found several puppets made up of rags and hog's bristles with headless pins in them with the points outward. And so I think, to correct earlier, I think I had said that the Irish woman, what was her name?
Oh, she also did.
Okay, they both did. Okay, so so common practice.
And this one has hogs, but Glover's had goat's hair.
And Hansen goes on to Hansen goes on to sort of explain the doll with pins in it is the classic charm of black magic, and burying it in a wall is still a technique of witches. Such charms have been found in the walls of rural English cottages in the 20th century. To be sure, the evidence was circumstantial. Nobody had seen Bridget Bishop stick the pins in the dolls or bury them in the walls, but she could, according to Cotton Mather, give no account of them to the court, quote, that was reasonable or tolerable, coupled with the other testimony against her that concerning the dolls was extremely incriminating. It would have that was extremely the evidence concerning the dolls was extremely incriminating, and it would have been quite enough, he notes, to get her hanged in 17th century England or burned in Scotland or on the continent, and says, yes, it is probable that Bridget Bishop was indeed a practicing witch. That's like a lot of people saying that.
The other thing is that there was a Quaker guy who said that she bought from him a lot of pieces of lace, some of which were so short that I could not judge them fit for any use. And Upham, the famous historian who is still consulted by many atheists, or at least by one atheist blog that I found, and who's an influential historian of the trials. He interpreted this to mean that Bridget Bishop was wearing clothing of a style incomprehensible to a simple Quaker, and later writers have followed him in this interpretation, coupling it with the fact that Bridget Bishop often wore a red paragon bodice, and leaving the impression that she dressed in a higher or more flashy fashion the community thought proper. That's something that is in Cry Innocent, that, she's wearing this sort of flashy outfit, and so that's, kind of implied. But red was not an unusual color for clothing in 17th century New England. That's another thing, people kind of, picture, these, Thanksgiving, pilgrims, with the buckles on their hats.
All black,
that was not how people dressed in Plymouth Colony or, in Salem. They dressed, kind of normal for the time, obviously. But red was not an unusual color for clothing in 17th century New England, and Shattuck said nothing about the cut of the laces she bought him for dyeing. He said the pieces were too small to be of any use. If Bridget Bishop had been dressing extravagantly, wouldn't her laces have been larger than usual? It would seem that what Shattuck meant was that the pieces of lace were too small to be worn by a human being, but they would not have been too small for dressing a witch's doll, which is often clothes in the same material and colors as the clothing worn by the victim. So basically, the reading is that he was upset because she was getting a crop top or some slutty, but he meant they were really small for a doll. To put on a doll, so
give these guys a little bit of credit. It wasn't just she's a
and also I don't think that I don't think that he would have assumed. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Like, he would have assumed that she was gonna wear, or that she even would. Like, I just think it wouldn't have occurred to anyone to like be like showing off their shoulders or whatever. Like, I'm sure that would have been mentioned in the trials too if she had.
Yeah, absolutely, because it wasn't necessarily okay, but that wasn't quite the substance of why people were sussed out by this.
No, they were sussed out by finding a bunch of poppets like in her walls that she couldn't explain, and by her like threatening people and like having an established reputation for practicing witchcraft. But yeah, so
exactly. There's that. Maybe we talk about another person who, in the opinion of Hansen, clearly practiced witchcraft, which is Wilmot Mammy Red.
Yes, we definitely should talk about old Mammy Red of Marblehead, but we should also note that the same Quaker guy was apparently after like a commercial dispute involving like some cider, she scratched the face of Shattuck's son, the Quaker guy. The child hath since then been followed with grievous fits, as if he would never recover more. His head and eyes drawn aside, as if they would never come to rights more, lying as if he were in a manner dead, falling anywhere, either into fire or water, if he be not constantly looked to, and generally in such an uneasy and restless frame, almost always running to and fro, acting so strange that I cannot judge otherwise but that he is bewitched, and by these circumstances do believe that the aforesaid Bridget Oliver, now called Bishop, is the cause of it, and it has been the judgment of doctors that he is under an evil hand of witchcraft. Hansen notes, notice again how willing the medical profession was to diagnose witchcraft. So, and, there were many other people who were terrified of her and had hysterical hallucinations as a result of their terror. Roger Corman testified that about 8 years before, he had been in bed with his wife with a light burning in the room. I, being awake to then see Bridget Bishop of Salem come into the room we lay in, and 2 women more with her, which 2 women were strangers to me. I knew them not, but Bishop came in her red paragon bodice and the rest of her clothing, which she then usually did wear, and quickly after they appeared the light was out, and the curtains at the foot of the bed open, where I did see her, and presently she came and lay upon my breast and body, and so oppressed me that I could not speak nor stir, no, not so much as to awake my wife, although I endeavored much so to do it. This is kind of like an old hag sort of like sleep paralysis thing.
Yeah.
The next night they all appeared again in like manner, and the said Bishop, alias Oliver, took hold of me by the throat, and I almost hauled me out of the bed. The Saturday night following, I have been that day telling of what I had seen and how I suffered 2 nights before. My kinsman William Coman told me he would stay with me and lodge with me and see if they would come again, and advised me to lay my sword athwart my body. So that was supposed to it's like a sort of cross shape, so that's the idea, like it's going to repel them with the cross. Quickly after we went to bed that said night, both well awake and discoursing together, in came all the 3 women again, and said Bishop was the first, as she had been the 2 other nights. So I told him, William, here they be all come again, and he was immediately struck speechless and could not move hand or foot. And immediately they got hold of my sword and strived to take it from me, but I held so fast they did not get it away. And then I had liberty of speech, and called William, also my wife, and Sarah Phillips that lay with my wife, who all told me afterwards they heard me, but had not the power to speak or stir. And the first that spake was Sarah Phillips, and said, in the name of God, Goodman Coman, what is the matter with you? So they all vanished away. Very similar to like an alien abduction type thing.
Yeah.
With the sort of paralysis. But yeah, anyway, so there was also the death of a child that was ascribed to her. And Hansen even says that the death of the child cannot be explained on natural grounds, except by suggesting that there was something wrong with it, quite unrelated to its father's experience. The issue is that, Samuel Gray, 14 years before that, awoke to see a woman standing beside the cradle in the room and the bedside, and she seemed to look upon him. So he did rise up in his bed, and it vanished. Then he went to the door and found it locked. And unlocking and opening the door, he went to the entry door and looked out. And then again to do the same woman he had a little before seen in the room, and the same guard she was in before. Then he said to her, in the name of God, what do you come for? Then she vanished away. So he locked the door again and went to bed, and between sleeping and waking he felt something come to his mouth or lips, cold, and thereupon started and looked up. and again did see the same woman with something between both her hands, holding it before his mouth, upon which she moved, and the child in the cradle gave a great screech out, as if it was greatly hurt, and she disappeared. And taking the child up, he could not quiet it for some hours, from which time the child, that before was very likely, a very likely thriving child, did pine away and was never well, although it lived some months after, yet in a sad condition, and so died. Some time after, within a week or less, he did see the same woman in the same garb or clothes that appeared to him as aforesaid, although he knew not her nor her name before. Yet both by her garb and countenance doth testify that it was the same woman they now call Bridget Bishop, alias Oliver of Salem. So yeah, Hansen also says that it's hard to explain how he had hallucinations of her before he knew her. Yes. But yeah, anyway, so yeah, and there's many other like sort of incidents like that. This is a kind of an interesting one though, which involves kind of like a familiar spirit, which so it's a similar encounter. My mistress told said Bridget that I had said or affirmed that she came one night and sat upon my breast as aforesaid, which she denied, and I affirmed to her face to be true, and that I did plainly see her, upon which discourse with her she threatened me. And sometime after that, I, not being very well, stayed at home on a Lord's Day, and on the afternoon of said day, the doors being shut, I did see a black pig in the room coming towards me. So I went towards to kick it, and it vanished away. I immediately after I sat down, did see a black thing jump into the window, and it came and stood just before my face. The body of it looked like a monkey, only the feet were like cock's feet with claws, and the face somewhat more like a man's than a monkey's. And I, being greatly affrighted, not being able to speak or help myself by reason of fear, I suppose, so the thing spoke to me and said, I am a messenger sent to you, for I understand you are troubled in mind, and if you will be ruled by me, you shall want for nothing in this world. Upon which I endeavored to clap my hands upon it and said, You devil, I will kill you. But I could feel no substance. And it jumped out of the window again and immediately came in by the porch, although the doors were shut, and said, You had better take my counsel. Whereupon I struck at it with a stick, but struck the ground sill, and broke the stick, and felt no substance. And that arm with which I struck was presently disenabled. Then it vanished away, and I opened the back door and went out, and going towards the house, and I espied said Bridget Bishop in her orchard going towards her house, and seeing her had no power to set one foot forward, but returned in again.
Wow. So she just happens to be kind of hanging out.
Just when an evil monkey with the feet of a cock and the face of a man
kind of
said,
terrifying.
I will give you everything in this world if you serve me. Jumped into her house. Yeah, Hansen, he makes the point that, because they are incorporeal, they have no substance that, is consistent with the idea that these are, hallucinations, so...
Oh, weep, ye maids of Essex, for your lads who've died, while bloody brook still ripples by the mountain side. Never shall they come again to see the ocean tide, and never shall a bridegroom return unto his bride. To bring the grain from Deerfield, they started on their way, with Lathrop as their leader upon that sunny day. Returning now they rested, their beasts began to tire, when deadly Indian muskets blazed out in murderous fire.
I want to just jump back real quick to the catalyst event that started all of this in 1692, because I think it's also an interesting kind of case study in kind of the relationship these people had to both white magic and black magic. So right. It started when Reverend Samuel Parris, several of his children started to become afflicted with this kind of strange, malady, and a lot of the things we described before. But Hansen writes, the trouble The trouble, according to Reverend John Hale, could be traced back to experiments made with the occult. And Hale writes, I fear some young persons, through a vain curiosity to know their future condition, have tampered with the devil's tools so far that hereby one door was opened to Satan to play those pranks, anno 1692. I knew one of the afflicted persons who, as I was credibly informed, did try with an egg and a glass to find her future husband's calling, i.e. occupation, till there came up a coffin, that is, a spectre in the likeness of a coffin, and she was afterwards followed with diabolical molestation to her death, and so died a single person, a just warning to others to take heed of handling the devil's weapons, lest they get a wound thereby. Another I was called to pray with, being under sore fits and vexations of Satan, and upon examination I found that she had tried the same charm. And after her confession of it and manifestation of repentance for it and our prayers to God for her, she was speedily released from those bonds of Satan. And Hansen writes that the egg and glass is a method of divining similar to crystal gazing, the white of an egg poured into a glass being substituted for the fortune teller's crystal ball. Little girls still play at divining their future husband's occupation using a variety of methods, including the old rhyme, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. It is quite innocent in the 20th century, but it was anything but innocent for the two 17th century girls who believed they conjured up a specter in the shape of a coffin. It is no wonder they began to display hysterical symptoms, and that one of them was, quote, followed with diabolical molestations to her death. And so it started, basically with this kind of little Ouija board prank.
Yeah, and the one who died is supposed to be Abigail, Abigail Williams.
This is caught again, Miller. Hale does not name the children, but the one who is cured is most probably Elizabeth Parris, the minister's 9-year-old daughter. She disappeared from Salem Village late in March when her father sent her to the household of Stephen Seawall in Salem Town, possibly because fits were known to be communicable, and he wanted her removed from contact with those who were still having them. The other girl was probably Parris's 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, although we have no way of being sure. There's very little information about the later lives of the afflicted girls. Tradition has it they were assisted in their occult experiments by Tituba, a slave woman Parris had brought to New England from Barbados, where he had been a merchant before becoming a clergyman. Tituba, like her husband John, was a Carib Indian, not a Negro, he adds, and although the egg and glass is
depicted again, caught again, Miller.
Caught again, Miller, pulling a little race-blind Hamilton action there. And although the egg and glass is an English rather than an Indian method of divining, she may well have been involved from the beginning. Certainly she would have often have been charged with the care of the children, and certainly she was soon involved in another occult experiment. In any case, the two girls were very sick. So were several of their friends who had also presumably been experimenting with the occult. There are Ann Putnam, Mary Warren, Mercy Lewis, Mary Wolcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard, all kind of between 12 and 17. Parris took them to various doctors, but they grew steadily worse. When Dr. Griggs made his diagnosis of witchcraft, Parris apparently did not at first accept it. He simply continued the prayer and fasting, which he hoped would cure the girls. If the minister was not anxious to believe the children were bewitched, the neighbors were. They began to ask the girls who was afflicting them, but at first they were unable to answer. It was then that Mary Sibley, the aunt of Mary Wolcott, turned to white magic to break the witch's spell. On February 25th, she went to the minister's Indian slaves, John and Tituba, and had them prepare a witch cake from a traditional English recipe, meal mixed with the children's urine. Okay. It was baked in the fire and then fed to the Parris dog, presumably on the theory that the animal was a familiar, a messenger assigned to a witch by the devil. Now, this is interesting. The minister was appalled when he discovered, a month later, what had been done. Mary Sibley's witch cake was, as Parris put it, a going to the devil for help against the devil. He lectured her privately about it, and before the entire congregation called her, quote, to deep humiliation for what she has done. She acknowledged her sinfulness in tears, but it was far too late. The witch cake had been baked, and by it, as Parris said, quote, the devil hath been raised among us, and his rage is vehement and terrible, and when he shall be silenced, the Lord only knows. Because the witch cake worked, another instance of the efficacy of magic in a society which believes in it. Now the girls were able to name their afflictors, Tituba herself and Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, two old women of dubious reputation. When these names were known, 4 yeomen of Salem Village in the county of Essex, Joseph Hutchinson, Thomas Putnam, Edward Putnam, and Thomas Preston, appeared before their magistrates and swore out warrants for the suspicion of witchcraft. And those 3 accused women were examined by 2 Salem magistrates, John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, and the accused women did not make a very good showing. Sarah Good behaved with all the malice and deceit one could expect of a witch. When she was asked who it was afflicted the children, if she did not, she was quite willing to accuse her fellow prisoner Sarah Osborne. Her husband William testified, quote, he was afraid that she either was a witch or would be one very quickly. When Hawthorne adds, I love how all these spouses are ratting on each other. It's kind of amazing. When Hawthorne asked if he had any concrete evidence of her practicing witchcraft, he replied that he had not. He thought her a witch for her, quote, for her bad carriage to him. Indeed, said he, I may say with tears that she is an enemy to all good. Besides this unintentional pun, because her name was Good, he offered the information that he had seen, quote, a strange tit or wart on his wife's body, the implication being that this was a so-called witch's tit, at which the devil and his familiars sucked the blood of the witch. And this is kind of amazing, too. Her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, or Dorcas. Dorcas feels like a mean name for a little kid. Also testified against her, announcing that her mother had familiars. Quote, 3 birds, 1 black, 1 yellow, and these birds hurt the children and afflicted persons. So, John Hawthorne, I think...
A little bit get into McMartin territory there with, the very young kid, just saying some stuff about animals, but never know.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yes.
Also, this is also, I just want to read this one more thing, because it's important about, the effect of these initial kind of, testimonies and stuff, by the court that impacted people's, belief was, Another precedent was set at this examination when Hawthorne asked the children to look at Sarah Good and say whether she was one who afflicted them. They accused her to her face, upon which they were all dreadfully tortured and tormented for a short space of time. When they recovered from their fits, they charged her with causing them, saying that her spectre had come and tormented them, although her body remained, quote, at a considerable distance from them. This was spectral evidence, that is, evidence concerning a spectre or apparition of the accused rather than her bodily person. It was eventually to become the central legal issue of the trials, but at the moment, we need only see why it seemed initially so convincing to the examining magistrates. Here were girls afflicted with violent physical symptoms which had no known physical cause, but which a physician had attributed to witchcraft. We trust science. There was a malicious old woman accused of causing them. When the sufferers accused her, they were immediately thrown into convulsions. What could be more plausible than that the convulsions were inflicted as revenge for the accusation? Yet such behavior was still unfamiliar enough in Salem, so that one of the recorders noted that, quote, none here sees the specters of the witches, but the afflicted and themselves. Certainly Hawthorne was convinced. When the children had recovered and repeated their accusation, he turned to the woman. Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done? Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you thus torment these poor children? She said, I do not torment them. He said, who do you employ then? She said, I employ nobody. I scorn it. And, this is funny. A part of Hawthorne's bullying may have been a result of Sarah Good's evasiveness, a sample of which remains on record. She was known to go muttering away from people's houses, and when Hawthorne asked her what she muttered, she answered, if I must tell, I will tell. And she says, it is the commandments. I may say my commandments, I hope. And Hawthorne asked, what commandment is it? She says, if I must tell, I will tell. It is a psalm. What psalm? She hesitated. Then, after a long time, she muttered over some part of a psalm. Almost any 17th century person hearing such an exchange would infer, perhaps not without reason, that Sarah Good was lying, that what she actually muttered as she left her neighbors' houses were curses. And certainly
that was the accusation against Wilmot Red, aka Mammy Red, or Old Mammy Red of Marblehead of the song. That she got into like a fight and sort of had cursed a woman, or I think that it was a woman. It was Mrs. Sims, I want to say. I need to find the relevant passage, but yeah, basically she said, like, would that you would never be able to urinate or defecate.
Yes.
It was Mrs. Sims. Like, basically, her maid stole some linen or something, and the quarrel grew so hot that Mrs. Sims threatened to swear out a warrant against the maid, upon which Mammy Red pronounced a curse. 2 witnesses swore to the substance of the curse, which was that Mrs. Sims might never urinate or defecate until she let her alone, and sure enough, Mrs. Sims was shortly taken with distemper of the dry bellyache, and so continued many months until she left the area. And that was basically what the curse was that convicted Old Mammy Red.
Yeah, so people, there were some strange things going on here.
Yes.
There was also a big thing that didn't bode well for Sarah Good was there was a death of a cow around that time, which perished in a sudden, terrible, and strange, unusual manner. And Hansen says that such testimony was common in witchcraft cases, and it has caused much unseemly hilarity among modern historians. I think this is a good point here. Is it likely, they have asked, that His Satanic Majesty the Devil or any of his minions would stoop to concern themselves with the fate of a New England cow? Owned with facts and logic. The answer is that nothing is more likely. I like that he's sticking to this. What else would a fertility god, like, Baphomet, whatever, concern himself with, but the health or sickness of crops, of animals, and of humans? From the standpoint of a society that still remembered who the devil was, no testimony could be more relevant. As a matter of fact, the village witches who still exist in rural England are often expert in folk medicines, human and animal, as well as charms, and until recently, many of them were midwives. So, I think that's an important point that, it almost reminds me of, like, whenever you find a kind of really far out, like, CIA conspiracy or something, and the normie heads are just kind of like, oh, you think, like, the CIA was, like, involved, they were, like, caught up in the Cold War. You really think they took the time to, like, go down to Golden Gate Park and pass out LSD? You know what I mean? Like, something like that. Or, like, they had better things to do than worry about, like, making sure that college kids took out. And it's like, okay, it betrays a kind of fundamental misunderstanding, I guess, first, that nebulous forces can kind of be in multiple places at the same time. I mean, it's way more true when you're talking about, like, a metaphysical force that, like, why wouldn't the devil, like, you know what I mean? It's even, like, cosmologically, just in the realm of the spiritual, like, why would a historian, I don't know. It seems very kind of
and also, like, this is, I like Hansen's explanation of the fertility aspect better, but also, like, they definitely will, like, Cotton Mather writes in his Wonders of the Invisible World, that this was, like, a very important mission that they had in the New World, because previously the devil had completely ruled America, so, and this was like a shining light, like a new Jerusalem, Zion, that was like this mission in the uttermost parts of the earth. So, of course, bringing them down, like, they were under, like, the ultimate attack. And his argument also was that God let the devil do this stuff when he was upset. So, like, when they slipped from what they were supposed to be doing, that's when, like, the devil could be allowed to be unleashed upon them. Aspect or an explanation of the reason for their targeting.
It definitely rings true that you would even see, like, kind of, I don't know, esteemed historians kind of, like, chuckling at the idea that anybody could be so religious that they would believe that the devil would, like, concern himself with, like, little old Salem and stuff like that.
Basically the same thing as being like, in this vast universe, I'm supposed to believe that God cares about like this, my life, and it's like, well, yeah, we're talking about a being that like can pay infinite attention to anything at any given time.
Exactly.
So like it's not like has to divide. It's the same thing of being like, if I were God, I would do a better job. Like, well, you're not God. You're a fucking human being, and there's no comparison between the two. So yeah,
there
it's
isn't.
foolish, and it's
just
like
on
a cheap,
kind of conceptual level, it's not the
point.
same.
Yeah, it's like it's intellectually unserious point. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly, but it gets like people. It's one of those intellectually indefensible points that people can make, and it plays well.
Yeah,
I think more often than not, and
yeah. Speaking of such scholars, one of the like somewhat more recent, influential, a couple years after Hansen's, one of a very influential take on witch hunt histories in general is kind of a genealogy of the impulses, similar to the vein of someone like Ginsberg or Cowan, who I mentioned. This guy is Norman Cohn, and he wrote Europe's Inner Demons, and it's about like kind of what the causes were of the Great Witch Hunt. And even he acknowledges that there were people, he's very skeptical about like the idea of witches or any society of witches. He's more in line with a standard view. But even he does acknowledge that there were people who did, try to like hex their neighbors and who practiced witchcraft like in these times. And he comes up with a very like interesting kind of, it's interesting in its own right. You can definitely take issue with it, but he's talking about the common theme of cannibalistic infanticide, something that's part of witch accusations, and also, part of the story of Kronos, which we've talked about before on the podcast, Hansel and Gretel, cannibal giants, etc. So he says, all these tales are inspired by the same preoccupation. Kronos and Tantalus are fathers intent on destroying their offspring. The wicked queen, the hag, the giant, and the giantess, too, are adults who try to destroy children, but in the end are destroyed by them. Talking about, fairy tales. The common theme is generational conflict between those who at present hold power and those who are destined to inherit it. And the means by which the adults try to retain power is precisely cannibalistic infanticide. This surely throws a new light on our problem. We have already seen that cannibalistic infanticide belongs both to the traditional stereotype of the heretical sect and to the traditional stereotype of the witch, and that for that very reason it was relatively easy, given the appropriate circumstances, to combine the two notions. We can probe deeper now. It seems plain that both stereotypes draw on one and the same archaic fantasy. Psychoanalysts would maintain that the unconscious roots of this fantasy lie in infancy or early childhood. Psychoanalysts of the Kleinian school would argue more specifically that infants in the first 2 years of life experience cannibalistic impulses, which they project onto their parents, and that the source of the fantasy lies there. Other psychoanalysts would advance different interpretations. It has been argued that many parents really do harbor unconscious cannibalistic impulses towards their children, and that children are subliminally aware of the fact. It has also been argued that children themselves can harbor unconscious cannibalistic impulses toward a younger sibling. The baby brother or sister who they see as an interloper or potential rival. So that's an explanation for the idea. Yeah,
okay.
A little bit. Okay, so
coming in hot there.
That's an interesting interpretation, and like, is that really less of a leap than the idea that maybe people have tried to eat babies? Like, but
well, honestly, that brings me to something really quickly that I think people were discussing this in the Subliminal Jihad Discord. I don't think we mentioned in the episode yet, but that stuff about Freud that somebody was posting last week on Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
And basically the idea that initially when Freud started his practice and he was dealing with neurotic patients who were suffering from these various like nervous disorders, his first kind of line of inquiry, his first kind of hypothesis was that, and these were mostly the children of like wealthy families, right, in Vienna. And his first inclination is that there was like widespread early child abuse going on in a lot of these families, and I think even postulated kind of a like sometimes occurring in a like a ritualistic format that then embedded itself in the subconscious and then was triggered later on in development and basically caused like psychosis. But then when he started advancing this, he got like really heavy like violent pushback from the rest of like the scientific community, and he eventually reversed himself and then came up with what became kind of something similar to what you just read, the Oedipal complex of like
of our subconscious cannibalistic impulses.
Yeah, where like parents and babies all want to like have sex with and eat each other.
I could just eat you up, or like I guess that's something that people say, but I don't know. Yeah.
I think that I'm going to stand by, like, I think Freud was right the first time. And it actually, if you think about it, his initial theory about, like, kind of widespread, like, child abuse going on, or like, sexual abuse or like, incest, things like that, especially among like wealthy and powerful people, which we already said that the kind of magistrates and reverends in New England were kind of more focused on, was the idea of like people in high places in an organized fashion doing this, rather than just like some old crone out by the the edge of town.
Yeah.
It kind of syncs up more with the the sort of paranoid theories of the prosecutors in the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, another theory that kind of makes sense is that, like, at some point, like in history, or maybe even ongoing to the present day, there is some kind of, like, cultic, like that these stories, these folk tales, encode some kind of, like, cultic practice of humans. I mean, we know human sacrifice was practiced in Sumeria, in Egypt, like at, certain times. In Mesoamerican civilization, like a lot of people say that the story of Abraham and Isaac is like about the replacement of human sacrifice with animal sacrifice. So
I just wanted to.
One could say that instead of like this whole thing of like babies like unconsciously wanting to be cannibals, like
that seems absolutely psychotic, to be perfectly honest.
I don't remember having any kind of desire to eat any human.
Or that I was gonna be eaten by like my parents. Like that is just so bizarre. Like the
idea that we're all babies are cannibals, and then they project that onto their parents, or like what? Okay, anyway, that's at least as much of a stretch as that, like the idea of cannibals was like something that existed and then was taken, or ritual cannibalism was taken like to, people took it too far maybe and prosecuted innocent people. Another thing that he says, going on further on this trend, definitely going down the religious line, he says, what is involved is not anti-clericalism. That was open, avowed, and very widespread throughout the later Middle Ages, nor is it intellectual agnosticism. That first appeared in the 17th century and only in very restricted circles. It is rather unconscious resentment against Christianity as too strict a religion, against Christ as too stern a taskmaster. Psychologically, it is altogether plausible that such an unconscious hatred would find an outlet in an obsession with the overwhelming power of Christ's great antagonist, Satan, and especially in fantasies of erotic debauches with him. It is not at all surprising the tension between conscious beliefs and ideals on one hand and unconscious desires and resentments on the other should lead some frustrated or neurotic women to imagine they had given themselves body and soul to the devil or to a subordinate demon. Nor is it surprising that these same tensions, operating in a whole stratum of society, should end by conjuring up an imaginary outgroup as a symbol of apostasy and of licentiousness, which is practically what witches became in many parts of Europe. So the two ideas that he proposes are that someone would imagine through repressed desires that they were a Satanist, and that people would imagine that there were Satanists because of their repressed desires to rebel against Christianity.
Wow.
But he doesn't consider the possibility that someone would actually be a Satanist.
Yeah.
Because,
what is this?
Which we witness even now.
Yeah. Exactly.
So
it doesn't really exist.
People today are like rebelling against like the suffocating grasp of Christianity, which is like, not really, such a big issue in our society at this time. In most places, maybe for some, but like by worshiping the devil. So the idea that like no one could have possibly done this, it's I don't know.
Or that nobody
like
would do it when it's such a huge part of human civilization. Like, it's transcultural and it's, the idea that for some reason, there's like this invisible mental wall that is built up around where these people cannot like acknowledge that there are actual groups of people who like stand around and act like robes and like try to do things like this. Like, even if it's almost like admitting that phenomenon occurs is somehow like lending credence to the fact that, to the notion that what they're doing is like quote unquote effective in the material world, when that's not even necessarily what we're saying. I think the phenomenon is much more kind of psychological and murky, but nonetheless, like, I think maybe because medical science has a difficult time like putting this in a clean box in terms of the instrumentalization of things like magic or various kinds of witchcraft, that they kind of want to I don't know, just like they don't want to reckon with it in a kind of serious way.
And I think that ironically, like, the myth of the Salem witch trials serves like a certain social purpose that like now is like one of these sort of civil myths that has a lot of fallacies. Like, the one that operates for most people is the Crucible one with like the heroic John Proctor, who it really is like a Christ figure in a way. Like, they forgive me, Father, they know not what they do. Get like etc. Like, which a lot of these accused witches weirdly didn't do if they were such pious Christians. Like, wouldn't they? But anyway, like so like the idea of like their martyrdom for like this in order for us to move past this like dark era of panic and like these beliefs in witchery or whatever. Like, it's kind of like this weird civil tenet that prevents people from having like a nuanced view on what occurred. That doesn't mean that like as the people at the time recognized that like that wasn't like like a horrible event. Like, I think even Cotton Mather, who at first defended, like, the judges and the magistrates out of a sense of, like, loyalty to them or whatever, he acknowledged, like, he ended up saying that there weren't witches, and that it was really just the devil,
okay. It was just the devil, like, psyoping everybody.
Yeah.
Into killing each other, basically.
Yeah, like they acknowledge, they even went further than Chadwick Hansen in saying that, we got it wrong or whatever. People don't have like
he Khrushcheved himself a little bit.
Yeah, a nuanced view on like how this can happen, because that requires in some way like implicating themselves, I guess. Like, it creates this, it's interesting, this whole outgroup of like the witches, it create like the new witches are the witch hunters, who
they are the hunter becomes the hunted.
Yes, who like they are like this ultimate evil who we like dissociate ourselves from so that we can think like, oh, I'm not like that. I mean, there was a funny quote in Hansen's book which was like talking about how like by the standards of the time they were very conscientious, they were very like even keel, like, and a lot of the, actual community leaders and magistrates were, more, with exceptions, they were, like, kind of on the level. He says that if the people today who passed judgment on the Puritans at Salem were witch judges, then, like, no one would have been, everyone would be killed for witchcraft, like, if they... like they would be sending everyone like to the gallows.
Old Mammy Red of Marblehead, sweet milk could turn to molding churn. On evil bent, with dire intent, practised in dark her dreadful art. Old Mammy Red of Marblehead, hanged on a tree till she was dead. Old Mammy Red of Marblehead, at dawn's first glow, turned into a crow. She'd cast a spell on Prue or Nell, and with a wish drive away codfish. Old Mammy Red of Marblehead, hanged hanged on a tree till she was dead. Old Mammy Red cursed good folks' bread. The crust was full of her blue wool. Old Mammy Red could speak with the dead. With Satan 'tis feared she was evilly rid. Old Mammy Red of Marblehead hanged on a tree till she was dead.
They do ironically have that same level of kind of like John Hawthorne, like that level of like vitriolic bullying kind of style of like, how dare you, like,
yeah, well, it's kind of like a recent instance, not that I approve of her appointment or like think that like Trump should be, I wish Trump wasn't appointing anybody like at all, and I wish that there were someone else appointing judges to the Supreme Court, like. But Amy Coney Barrett, who is someone who people were like, oh, she's from The Handmaid's Tale, like she's in a cult or whatever, know, like
it was kind of a counter witchcraft, like an inverted witchcraft,
she's
kind of allegations.
Like, hyper conservative, like, and she probably will. Ironically, like I think it's probably likely that she won't do any of the like Roe v. Wade stuff. I could be wrong. I'll admit that I'm wrong if she does go after it. But I think she might just rubber stamp a bunch of fashy bullshit, like, in general, and not actually do the social conservative stuff she's supposed to do. But, like, either way, like, she's a ultra conservative, obviously, but, like, she, like, the way that people acted like she was in a cult or, like, that she was The Handmaid's Tale, like...
Yeah, literally, like...
There's definitely substantive objections you can make, like... One crazy thing I read about her was that, like, she ruled that it was okay to, like, deny immigration, like, to someone if they might eventually one day possibly require government assistance. Like, you couldn't get a green card. Like, there's all sorts of bizarre stuff like that. But everyone's sort of focused on, her, like, religious beliefs.
The charismatic group that she's in.
Yeah, right. Which is, like, whatever. But, yeah. But... Yeah, like, there's still this kind of, like, out-group phenomenon that happens, and it's become this sort of myth of goodies and baddies.
Goodies, no
like
pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. The goodies are people like John Proctor, the noble Christian Bale, who was like an abusive maniac who was chasing around his like 11-year-old servant with hot tongs.
Yeah.
And like Giles Corey, who also beat up his servants and things like that, or
and even a lot of these people, like including one of the people snapped up in this trial, whose name is Candy, who's a black slave from Barbados. Was at first accused of casting spells and things like that, but then under examination, she actually revealed that she, people thought maybe at first that she had taken, she had adopted some kind of a, witchy kind of religion from like the West Indies or then maybe from Africa. But then it turns out that she was actually taught witchcraft by her mistress, Mrs. Hawks. So it was like the white lady who was doing it. And
much like the women are often taking the fall for the men who are the real magicians and necromancers.
That's true. There was also Reverend George Burroughs, who was accused in this, who seemed to be, at the very least...
like just as guilty as old Mammy Red to me. He would always be like, he'd come back and like tell his wife, like, and the people, like, his family who he, like, terrorized and always threatened, like, I can hear what you're saying about me, and they'd be like, are you eavesdropping? He's like, no, my God tells me what you're saying, and, like, and
that was not an apparition. That was, like, they were out picking strawberries, right?
Yeah, or something like.
But he was also
doing.
He was exposed as kind of like a pathological liar, also. So it was kind of hard to pin down the kind of things he would claim. But I guess he did kind of like falsely claim. He probably was just overhearing his his sister and brother-in-law, but still like threaten them by saying that like because he worships Satan, he can overhear what they say.
Well, he didn't say that he worships Satan, but he did say
or
like
said my God. Well,
yeah.
I mean, you know, hypothetically, all these people are of the same denomination, so you know, why else would you be saying my God? And of course, because God doesn't allow you to do little magic tricks like that. Only the devil does in this kind of world of belief that these people lived in.
Right.
And,
God doesn't, you know, like help you to like reveal gossip to like terrify your wife and your family, you know.
No, it doesn't. And you know, but nonetheless, I think, you know, going back to that theme of like witchcraft can be effective in a society that believes in it.
Yeah, he also apparently held up a 7-foot fowling piece by inserting his forefinger in the muzzle, or lifted a barrel of molasses by inserting 2 fingers into the bung. Burroughs had told some of these stories himself. Now they were coming back to haunt him, since they seemed to the community evidence of a strength that was pretty preternatural. And he also like plagiarized some manuscript like at his trial, and said that he like came up with something that was stolen and then like tried to get out of it. He had conspicuously avoided taking communion. He said it was so long since he had taken it he could not tell so long, and he had baptized only the eldest of his children. But one cannot be... Yeah, it's funny. It says he, you know, it's possible he was a worshiper of the devil, but one cannot be certain. Perhaps he was only a liar who liked to boast of occult powers. Yes,
also possible.
Yes, that's what Chadwick Hansen has to say.
Yeah.
But
you know,
yeah,
I mean, but you know, in the view of the people that are like sitting in this courtroom who don't have a clear scientific explanation for how any of this works, it's intriguing how these children, like at the moment that they you know named like Sarah Good as one of the witches, they all seize up and have like horrible pains and everything. And I mean, I guess you could say that, you know, they were doing it to themselves, and in that case Sarah Good should have been just let go. But I mean, then at the same, you know, I don't know. I mean it's a fascinating kind of thing, but
and I mean, like, you know, I mean, I think that the idea that it works like through, there's many things like in our world that operate through belief. I think we've used the example before, like of the stock market, like, you know, and it's usually not so simple as saying like don't think of, you know, like don't think about it, you know, like don't believe it, you know, it's not like I mean, Hansen in his book, which was in 1969, you know, he says, like, well, we no longer have this because the belief in witchcraft has faded, but it's coming back.
Here it comes. But, you know, but I think the context in which it's coming back is also very different right now, you know, because instead of there being a great fear, and because I mean, part of maybe what the thesis is the thesis he's trying to advance in this book a little bit is that if there is a pervasive fear of witchcraft, then embracing the rituals of witchcraft and like aiming them at people, almost like it may as well be considered a violent crime, because you're like preying upon the belief that, you know, people take seriously, and it's like it will work if everybody believes in it. But then, you know, when you get into the question of kind of like, well, now that we have a kind of like secular, more certainly not monolithic religiosity, I mean, it's like there's different denominations, and there's probably a decent chunk of people that are like not, you know, even people that go to church, that's not the totalizing kind of level of it's not the same like totalizing theological worldview that it was in the 17th century, and there's a lot of science that has sort of, you know, worked its way in that kind of, you know, I think takes the juice out of that fear response. But I genuinely wonder kind of like what kind of power is witchcraft capable of in a more or less kind of secularized United States, as opposed to New England.
Do we necessarily think that, like, I mean, it depends. Do you agree that he, like, you know, it's all psychosomatic, or is there some real power that exists? I mean, even John Hale did eventually suggest that the power had to do with, like, the belief of the mind. And I think, you know, there's some possibility of that, but I also wonder, I think that belief is a very tricky thing. I mean, Freud also wrote about the return of the repressed, and how something these fears come roaring back in a way. If you he described it as being oh, so ghosts really do, the feeling of the uncanny that happens when you see your doppelganger on the street or whatever, and then these buried fears and these buried beliefs come resurging to the surface. That's what he kind of talked about. So I think it's a tricky thing to say and I think that a lot of these religious impulses still operate under different disguises and things like that. This was a society where everyone believed in witchcraft, so it's a completely different thing. It's kind of I was thinking about Casey Anthony while I was reading this, and if you take away the crime that Casey Anthony committed and replace it with tormenting a child through witchcraft, you can kind of see the difference is that people don't believe that that's possible anymore. People don't believe that witchcraft can do anything. But if you do think that's a serious crime, then a lot of the things that people used to convict Casey Anthony, although she did get off, but what was convicted her in the court of popular opinion, was that she was constantly lying, things like that she didn't seem to care, things Bridget Bishop being oh, if I was a witch, you'd know it, if Casey Anthony said that, people would be
my
oh
God.
my God, exactly,
no, totally.
But yeah, so yeah, there's
if you want to take a more modern example, nowadays it's the McMartin case, for example. It was kind of the very witchy parts of the accusations that kind of undermine that case more than anything else. If it had been kind of strictly about abusing children at a daycare center and didn't have this element of, we saw the teacher levitate, and people were doing magical things, these 5-year-old kids were saying that they saw basically magic happening, and that these people were doing some kind of weird witchcraft thing. But even by the 1980s, I mean, of course it sort of freaked out a part of the country, but I think the consensus was kind of on the other side of the ball by that point, where the media was not going to seriously entertain that these people were a coven of witches that were abusing children for ritual purposes. The idea being that doesn't work. Why would you ritualistically abuse children? Magic isn't real. You know what I mean? But of course, they're not kind of thinking about it. There could be all kinds of reasons why they could either be pretending to do magic, or maybe there is something that we're not fully kind of aware of in terms of techniques of imprinting trauma on people, or mind control, or things like that, like brainwashing, that kind of stuff. Or doing it in a ritualized format gets you a different outcome than not doing it in a ritualized format, and all these things. But that's so far beyond the kind of scientific consensus in the late 20th century to today. The myth of the Salem witch trials is one that I think serves in a lot of ways to uphold that consensus and protect it from, because if this, in the same way that Cotton Mather said, if we can't prove the existence of the spiritual world, if these Sadducees get their way, then Christ will become nothing but a light within, and heaven will become nothing but a frame of mind, right? So it's the same thing where if we question these ideas, then we're going to become the evil, crazy, Puritan society that really was not as crazy, was relatively reasonable compared to a lot of the other societies in the Western world in the 17th century in terms of this type of stuff. Exactly. It wasn't that out of line. But that's the idea. Obviously we don't want to go back to the 17th century, for various reasons, but the idea is that if we open these questions up, it's all going to come crashing down, and we're going to end up back
at the Salem witch trials.
Yeah,
people
which
like,
I think is, fundamentally, like, that is not how, I think even just in like a I don't know, historical materialism sense is like impossible, and, get real. Come on. We're not going back to, like, I think that's maybe the fundamental thing. It's like, if there's some, something kind of that doesn't hit right about, like, The Handmaid's Tale itself it's like a thing, is that, like, we're not going to go back to that. And maybe you could just say, like, fuck you, Dimitri. You're like a man. You don't understand. Amy Coney Barrett is going to take everything away. And it's like, I'm not saying that there's not going to be, repressive forms of control, but I don't think you can point to too many historical examples of us, like, some kind of ideological edifice, crumbling, or some kind of superstition crumbling, and suddenly we're back like 300 years in the past.
Yeah, I mean, The Handmaid's Tale, like, the way that it happened is quite something. I don't, like, really... I mean, I feel like maybe there's, like, a conceit of it, like, that, like, people stopped being fertile or whatever. It was like a Children of Men type thing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so, like, maybe that caused society to kind of degenerate to the point where what happened was possible. So that's, like, a whole different thing, like,
sure.
That kind of makes it, like, makes the whole thing stabilize, is the idea there's this massive social transformation that can lead to epistemological transformations.
I guess that you're right.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, in a kind of dystopian sci-fi, like, generic, framework, I think that kind of does justify. It's like, what if there was this, like, crazy phenomenon that happened that, science couldn't deal with, but absent something
it's
like that.
It's like a phenomenon that baffles science in a way. So, like, the whole... like, the way it's held up now is like, we're going away from science, but the whole thing kind of depends on this, like, sort of deus ex machina of, like, science destroying, science annihilating phenomenon of, like, mass infertility that can't be dealt with or explained. But
exactly.
Anyway, I hope I'm remembering it correctly, but...
I think that is, like, more or less what it is. But you know what? So I don't know. What do we think about today, where there is a kind of rising popularity in, like, witchy stuff? What kind of power can that actually affect? Because I think there's a lot of...
I was going to say, I do remember, like, kind of in the same vein as what we've been talking about, like, when there was the hex that was cast upon the moon.
Oh, yeah.
I remember someone saying that, like, I drank moon water or something, which is... will put water out, like, on the windowsill to, like, absorb the energies of the moon, or they'll do lunar-based practices, or, like, draw energy from the moon or something.
Yeah.
And one witch said that she did this, and then she was, like, sick and, like, in bed, like, for days, like, because of the hex upon the moon that had been cast. So that, I feel like, is a very, like, Chadwick Hansen type story of, like, where he would be like, well, because she believed in the hex on the moon affected her.
So I guess, like, the logical question there is, like, is TikTok going to re-indoctrinate people into being afraid of the powers of witchcraft, and thereby like, make it real again in a way?
Well, I did read about this one, because I was reading, more about, like, the whole, like, sort of obliquely around this. I was reading more about the whole, like, or elliptically reading more about the whole, like, Margaret Murray, like, witch cult hypothesis, like, the idea of, because I think, more and more people kind of are coming to a more synthesized idea, like, this whole notion of the Wiccan idea of, like, a pagan survival was just sort of rejected at one point. Like, there's no real evidence for this, but now people are coming, towards a synthesis between this idea and, the more critical notion. Yeah, I did, in sort of reading elliptically about this, I came across this document that I guess was first published at the very end of the 19th century called The Gospel of the Witches by Charles G. Leyland, which he claimed he got from, some, like, intermediary, kind of like David Myatt, saying that he had, like, some mistress of the, dark who initiated him into the Order of the Nine Angles as part of its, aeonic change. He claimed that he got this document from someone who knew about, ancient witch religions. It was called The Gospel of the Witches, and, there was a kind of a goddess who was a daughter of Diana, called Aradia, and her brother, Lucifer, who is the god of the sun and the moon, the god of light, who was sent to the earth to teach the poor and resist the oppression of the wealthy classes through magic and witchcraft. So
whoa, hold up. Lucifer's not a leftist, okay? He's not Karl Marx. Jesus was the first communist.
Well, according to the Gospel of the Witches, he was together with Aradia, this, figure. And so people were kind of trying to assess whether, this was real. There's a paper on it by Sabina Magliocco of California State University. And she kind of is trying to appraise, the reality of this. And she says some interesting things using, a concept in folklore studies called ostension. So she writes, and this kind of gets into the idea of the belief versus disbelief. She says, a legend is a story set in the real world about an extraordinary or numinous event. Legends are typically told as true, with many features that root them in a specific time and place and lend them authenticity. But they are not necessarily believed by all who tell them. In fact, according to legend scholars Linda Degg and Andrew Vascioni, it is the tension between belief and disbelief that keeps legends alive and circulating, as each new listener must decide, is this true? Could this have happened? Within any given community, there are legend believers and disbelievers. Our community is, of course, no exception when it comes to this particular legend. The truth content of legends, that is, how closely they correspond to actual historical events, can vary widely. Although they contain a kernel of reality, many legends are, quote, true only in the most metaphorical sense, that they are an accurate reflection of popular attitudes, values, and morality at a given time or place. So she goes on. Legends can take many forms. Most typically, they occur as narratives, either in the first person, this actually happened to me, or third person, this actually happened to a friend of a friend long ago. Logically, many legends start out as first-person accounts and become third-person accounts, but just as often, a narrator may retell a third-person account as though it actually happened to him or her, making the story more vivid for the audience. Legends can also exist as simple statements, i.e., the house in the hill is haunted, e.g., and occasionally become dramatic enactments known as ostension, which I will describe later at some length. So I will skip to where she talks about ostension, but basically ostension is where a legend is enacted dramatically. So what she's saying is that these ideas about Aradia and her brother Lucifer, the stuff in the gospel of this, might be not real, but in taking it as real, it might not be a legitimate document, maybe Leyland forged it, maybe Charles Leyland just fabricated some of this stuff, but enacting it, maybe it gains some reality, or maybe some of the myths about witches that circulated, sometimes people did kind of enact upon them. This is what Magliocco says.
Okay.
Anyway, so she talks about if Sibylla, Piriana, and Bellezza were indeed members of a society, their stories begin to make a certain amount of sense, talking about, people who attested to be members of witch societies in medieval Italy. This is especially true if we consider two additional tentative assumptions. The idea of ostension and that of the autonomous imagination. Ostension is Degg and Vasnoi's term for the enactment of legends. For example, very appropriate to the current season, a Halloween haunted house may portray legends about ghosts, vampires, and werewolves, or a pagan ritual may dramatize the legend of Robin Hood. Ostension always derives from a pre-existing legend. The legend precedes the existence of its enactment. This, I think, next example pertains more to the sort of witchcraft stuff we're talking about, the malefic witchcraft. Thus, for instance, legends of contaminated Halloween candy predated the finding of actual contaminants in treats by at least 10 years. Individuals who place needles, razor blades, and other dangerous objects in treats as pranks engage in a form of ostension. So the idea that people were going to do this existed before people actually started to do this. So we see the same thing, I think, in...
These things are almost born originally in the imagination, and then they sort of get out as memes, and then eventually somebody...
And we definitely see that in modern day, the idea of Satanism, LaVeyan Satanism on the surface. You could say this is, old, blah, 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 but, just on the surface level of, a LaVeyan Satanism, that is someone becoming a Satanist, to be provocative, basically following a religion that was made up for like Hollywood movies to scare people in theory.
Well, that also a really, I don't know, tell me if this is not a really good kind of example of this happening, but just the other night I watched for the first time in years, I rewatched Scream. And, I've been on kind of a Wes Craven kick lately. I realize I think he's kind of, in a way, like underappreciated in some respects. But Scream, is a kind of this like meta 90s slasher movie. But the whole thing in Scream is that the murderers are these two teenagers who have become so obsessed with slasher movies that they kind of concoct their own ridiculously convoluted like two-person conspiracy to basically like murder a bunch of their friends and various people in their town and get away with it in a kind of perfect way that, I mean, even at the end when they're kind of doing the obligatory, describing to Neve Campbell what their evil plan is and how they're going to get away with it, Matthew Lillard goes, because everybody knows you got to have a sequel, right. and it's because the movie has seeded these ideas into their mind and they're like such like, TV brained like Gen Xers that basically like this is the coolest thing to them is to imitate something they've seen in the horror movie genre that they love so much, and basically they bring it into fruition and actually do it, even though the stories that they're basing their whole thing on are completely fictional, like Michael Myers and Jason, etc., etc. These are all fictional things that did not ever happen in the quote real material world, but nonetheless, like the idea became manifest and then actually became a real thing because of the fictional meme.
And
to begin with.
Scream 4 like takes it to a whole new level where like at least in the original Scream it was for revenge. Spoiler alert for Scream, I guess you already kind of gave it away. But
it's a thin revenge. It's like you won't sleep with me. Which
well, it was also because of his mother, or her mother, right?
Oh, that's right. Because her mother had an affair with his dad, and that's why his dad left, and he didn't have a dad, right? That's right.
Yeah, but by the time of Scream 4, it became just straight up about like becoming famous for doing this. And I think actually another Wes Craven movie, it could possibly be an even more trenchant example in the idea of like Freddy Krueger.
Wes Craven's New Nightmare?
Well, just Freddy himself, and especially New Nightmare, because that's like takes it to a meta level. But even the idea of Freddy as someone who like his power literally comes from people's belief in his legend and the fear of him and his, the dreams manifest in reality. And then, of course, A New Nightmare takes it to a meta level.
I'm happy you brought that up because over the last, 2 weeks, I watched every single Nightmare on Elm Street movie, like all the way from number 1 through Wes Craven's New Nightmare. And Wes Craven's New Nightmare, highly recommend that to anybody. I mean, maybe watch, the first one, they're all kind of satisfying, I have to say. I think they actually hold up surprisingly well because they are so heavily rooted in the psychological dimension of belief being critical to the menace of Freddy. The idea that Freddy is kind of this meme, he only shows up in your dreams, and then the constant, pretty much he's on a hot streak the first 4 or 5 movies of just killing everybody that tries to get away from him because nobody takes them seriously, nobody ever, the belief is not widely held in society that Freddy is real, and so these kids are kind of left defenseless to sort of fight back against him, and they can only stay awake for so long, and he comes and gets them, and then in the second one he does a little bit almost like a MK Assassin kind of thing where he kind of takes over the body of this teenager and then gets him to commit murders. And then, of course, the murder is framed on this kid, and nobody even suspects that, it's Freddy. Kind of directing the whole thing. And then, of course, Wes Craven's New Nightmare is kind of fascinating because it stars the girl, I'm forgetting the actress's name, the girl who plays Nancy, the protagonist of like the first and third movies, the original kind of like, last girl or whatever, survivor of Freddy, but it stars her as herself as the actor, and she starts to have nightmares that like Freddy is haunting her, and it ends up the cause for it ends up being that Wes Craven, who plays himself, is working on a new Freddy script that stars her, and the story that he's writing into his screenplay is happening to her like in real time as she's writing it. And Wes Craven has some like hilarious kind of like a scene where he describes how ever since the Freddy movie stopped, he's been able to like enter into our world, so he has to write like one more movie to like end Freddy once and for all. And all this stuff, like it gets very, very kind of heady and meta, but in a kind of fun way, I guess. But there's a great scene where like she goes on a talk show to talk about Nightmare on Elm Street, and they're like, she's already been having Freddy nightmares, and then it's like, we got a special surprise for you, and then everyone starts cheering, and Freddy like rips apart like the set and like pops out like, I'm back, and she has to sit there kind of laughing and like clapping, but she's kind of like low-key haunted by it,
horrified of Robert Englund.
Even though they're like
Englund
friends,
is like painting like dark pictures of Freddy like being haunted by it. I remember that. I haven't seen, I think New Nightmare is like the most recent Freddy movie.
Well, if you count Freddy versus Jason, I believe is the final canonical. I think it's the last one with like Robert Englund. There was a remake in 2009, I think, where a new person plays Freddy. So I don't count that, and it didn't get any sequels. So I count actually. I mean, I'd say either Wes Craven's New Nightmare or Freddy versus Jason is the capstone of the whole series.
Freddy versus Jason kind of blew, but
I did see that. I think I saw it in theaters in high school.
I think I saw it in high school or early in college, on demand TV or whatever. But I was thinking relative to like the power of belief. Something that came to my mind was Julia Yaffe, who I feel like we've mentioned on the podcast before, or Ioffe as I've called her. Yes. She had a thread a while ago about how she believes she has COVID even though she's tested negative for it like 5 times.
Is this the long COVID article?
I think maybe it is.
That's what people are derisively calling it, is that like you never actually test positive, but you believe that you're suffering for months. From this ailment.
Doctors tell me why I have COVID. Why won't the tests? She's been sick for over the month with doctors long ago diagnosed as COVID. So why has Julia Yaffe repeatedly tested negative? So, maybe like who knows, the tests.
Maybe it's
or
like
something, or maybe it's just like she has COVID because she wants to have COVID. She certainly loves attention.
I think Devin, maybe Allah is punishing her for spreading so much Russiagate.
For hanging out with Richard Spencer, maybe. Who knows? But
she actually, just related to that, she is the one who just wrote a big article. I have to muster up like the energy to like read through the whole thing. It's one of these like Atlantic, I think, long reads, but it was all about how like a brave, cool, awesome CIA operative got hit with like sonic weapons when he was in Russia, and he's convinced that like Russia like targeted him with these, the same thing as like the Havana, the Cuban embassy, and all these U.S. embassy workers that were coming down with strange ailments. And but it kind of almost syncs up with what we're talking about here, where there's this guy who's claiming that he's had all these health problems as a result of being targeted by some kind of experimental sonic weaponry or something like that. But the CIA kind of won't, I don't know, they won't kind of give him any medical care. They've kind of brushed him off, and now he's kind of mad. And, she writes it in a whole context of like, what are you doing, CIA? Like, one of your brave soldiers has come down with like Russian, a Russian attack. Like, why aren't they helping it? I think maybe it's because like, I don't know, I've gotten the vibe ever since that Havana thing started to happen that like I would not put it above the U.S. to like do this to themselves. and then blame Cuba, blame Russia, all these different things, you know. But it still kind of brings, it's like that's even in our modern technological era. There's the kind of, or, you know, being like a targeted individual also. Yeah. You know?
Well, like, I mean, in general, like, there's many cases of, like, demonic possession, like, both in you know, the Western world as well as, like, in other countries. Like, you know, there's, I mean, witchcraft is still, like, a huge phenomenon, like, in a lot of the world where it's, like, widely believed in, and it can still operate in, you know, certain places. Like, one great book about, like, you know, the whole problem of, like, psychoanalysis and dealing with sort of possession or the unseen world is Knot of the Soul by Stefania Pandolfo, which is about kind of, it's like an ethnography of Morocco. It's like one of the few ethnographies that I actually like, but I recommend that book a lot because it deals with this problem in like a very interesting way. But I was just going to say, like, more broadly, that, like, you know, of course, we, you know, I already mentioned the stock market. There's, like, many things that, like, in our world function by belief, and, like, you can, you know, beyond, like, the whole psychosomatic illness thing, like, you really can, like, die of fear. You can die of, you know, we hear now about deaths of despair, things like that. You can die, you know, you can waste away from not having hope. You know,
my God, yeah, look at it right now. This whole year of like lockdowns and uncertainty, suicide rates are up and all these stuff. It's not like anything, you know, kind of external. Well, I mean, it is environmental in a way, but it's not like people that are, say, choosing to kill themselves or succumb to opioid overdoses or just like, you know, mentally in a not good place right now. It's not that, you know, something's coming in and like directly like doing that to them. It's much more kind of complicated and
instead of like a spectral being, like, you know, forcing occult poisons down your throat, instead, like, you know, our like twisted society is forcing like opioids and alcohol like down your throat to, you know, through like the processes of alienation, you know, at the risk of a somewhat tortured metaphor, you can you know, go with that route. But yeah, I don't know what the future holds for witch talk. You know, you
assume they would be able to you know, to hex Trump out of office or something like that, but I guess, you know, certain boulders
I heard one theory that he wants, like, you know, the hex is that he like doesn't, you know, like, as he recently said, like, I had a great life, you know, before he became president or whatever. So maybe like I heard one theory that the hex like is working, but it's because he really wishes that he didn't want to become president. He doesn't want to be president. So, like, you know, by cursing him to be unhappy, you know, the real curse is that he's president.
Ooh, that's tough. Yeah. You got to be careful what you curse for.
Yeah. But Anyway, I think that people were concerned that God was angry at them, and therefore he empowered them, like the witches, to harm them. At least that's a view that Cotton Mather expressed. But I think that, you know, if everyone just, you know, trusts in God, he can protect them from the existing crop of witches to the point that no trials would be necessary.
Indeed.
Yes,
indeed.
I don't think that they're of the level of conjuration that, you know, except, you know, maybe not the ones that we're seeing on TikTok. Maybe you know, hidden away and higher echelons. You know, you can see some advanced sorcerers. Yeah.
Exactly. I don't know. So, I mean, I guess, you know, final verdict. What do you think?
Cotton Mather did nothing wrong.
Agreed.
And, Mammy Red, I don't know. Like, yeah, kind of. Like, I could see it. Bridget Bishop, you know, really pushing it. Burroughs, kind of a sus lord. Yeah, pretty sus. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like Again, Cotton Mather is Islamophobic for saying that the devil had a Quran, or that the devil's book, which was a list of witches' names, resembled the Quran. What does that even mean? The Quran isn't a list of Puritan women's names.
I know.
Pretty Islamophobic. So he did that wrong. And insofar as he was down with genociding Native Americans by virtue of being a Massachusetts colonist, he did that wrong. But in terms of the witch trials, especially in context, relative to the others around him and the some of the other witch trials that occurred, he's not the villain that he's made out to be.
Yes, I think that much we can agree on.
Miller lied.
Miller did lie. Miller definitely lied.
He lied. He lied hard. It's one of those. It's definitely a Betsy Ross created the American flag situation with the Salem witch trials, where we're just swimming in nonsense that is totally not real.
I think that I guess he wanted to make a little slam dunk on McCarthyism by doing this play, but instead he I don't know.
He made a hero out of a maniacal tongue-wielding freak, and
AKA
kind of slandered a girl who possibly died of witch-induced molestation. Yeah,
exactly.
Into a tramp who brought down a whole community because she wanted to have sex with John Proctor. A
nasty woman.
Well, in a way,
who, even though he tweaked the ages to 16 and 30, still problematic, John Proctor.
Yeah, even even that book I read about the Witch of Kilkenny was misogyny doesn't really hold up as the real reason for some of this stuff. A lot of the historians are kind of dismissive of reducing it just to misogyny, and as we saw in even though that's kind of the we are the daughters of the witches, you couldn't burn this kind of a feminist thing, there were a lot of witches killed at Salem who were creepy old men who it wasn't just uppity women who challenged the patriarchy by buying garments that were too small,
and too red.
They were too small because they were being used to dress sinister puppets that she was using to torment innocent girls. It's
not nice in a society where everybody fanatically believes in witchcraft to go do witchcraft to underage girls.
They also believed in witchcraft. It's kind of like if you have a gun that you think is full of bullets, but it's actually full of blanks, and you fire it at someone.
You're right. In the court of law, in our hallowed courts of law, that would still be a felony.
Not only that, but a lot of the people who were hung as witches at Salem, including Bridget Bishop and Wilmot Red, are still attained by the state of Massachusetts as being witches.
Really? They've not
their
been
convictions
pardoned?
have not been overturned. No, they're still considered witches.
Well, a little bit like Trotsky, a little bit like Tukhachevsky, a little bit like Yagoda.
Cotton Mather is much like Stalin. He's a man of steel. One was a man of cotton.
He's a man of steel. Some underlings did some bad things, but they were perhaps Satanists themselves. And, the capitalists, the fascists, the social fascists,
his only crime was
they
being
play their
loyal
tricks.
to his friends. So
I think we'll get to that another day. But I think for now, I think we can leave it there. I think there's some interesting food for thought there, and
happy Halloween. Watch out for beware the shadow of the witches upon the moon. Beware of nocturnal flights. Don't sign any books wielded by male goat and or
a monkey with
monkey with
chicken
crow's
feet and a human face, and please do not boil like a pot of like children's piss and try to drink it to rid your home of demonic influence.
Yeah, that probably. Well, you know, even if it
perhaps
does work,
worked.
that's just going to the devil to fight the devil. So don't do that.
That's definitely a motto on subliminal jihad: is do not go to the devil to fight the devil.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It's good advice. Thank you, Samuel Paris. And if a raven alights on a nearby branch and tells you Ikra, you know, to read the Holy Scriptures, then you know, by which I mean, of course, the Quran, you should do that. Which is not the book of the devil. It is actually a profound revelation and not just a random list of you know, Bridget Bishop's name, etc.
She wishes.
Yeah.
She wishes. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So keep all that in mind in this very spooky season, and I think we'll be back. I think next time for a Q&A episode. After this, we got some good stuff going on.
Yeah.
So anybody that hears this, it's on the all-wire frequency. If you want to, I don't know how many days you'll have, but if you want to get in a question on the Discord, now's your time to do so. We will address it. We will dig in. Yeah. But until that time, don't cast spells on people. And stay vigilant.
Yeah, watch out for ostended razor blades in your Halloween candy, etc.
Or psychotic teenagers that want to recreate 80s slasher movies.
Yeah.
Etc.
Yeah. Don't forget to wear your mask. Stay prepared to unexpected, you know. Watch out for jinns.
Yeah, watch out for jinns, sometimes taking the form of a man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. There's a lot to worry about. But anyways, until next time. Dear folks, stay vigilant.
Peace.
Susanna Martin was a witch who dwelt in Amesbury. With brilliant eye and salty tongue, she worked her sorcery. And as unto the judge's court, the sheriff brought her hither. The lilacs drooped as she passed by, and then were seen to wither. A witch was she, though trig and neat, with comely head held high. It did not seem that one as she with Satan so would vie. And when in court the afflicted ones proclaimed her evil ways, she laughed aloud and boldly then met Cotton Mather's gaze. Who hath bewitched these maids, he asked, and strong was her reply. If they be dealing in black arts, you know as well as I. And now the stricken ones made moan as she approached near. They saw her shape upon the beam, so none could doubt 'twas there. The neighbors round swore to the truth of her satanic powers, that she could fly o'er land and stream and come dry shod through showers. At night 'twas said she had appeared, a cat of fearsome mien. Avoid she, devil, they had cried, to keep their spirits clean. The spectral evidence was weighed, then stern the parson spoke. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, 'tis written in the book. Susanna Martin, so accused, spake with flaming eyes. I scorn these things, for they are naught but filthy gossip's lies. Now those bewitched, they cried her out, their voices loud did ring. They saw a bird above her head, an evil yellow thing. And so Susanna Martin died beneath the summer sky. And still in scorn she faced the rope, her comely head